So is, I guess maybe he's not coming, or maybe I should give him a call. Yeah, maybe they have something with a kid. Anyway, I want to go back to the section on history, and then, as I mentioned, I think it's important that we then look at sections 50 through 53. Really, basically, is the sections on being towards death and authentic being in the world and being towards death. So today let's try to get through that, and then next week I thought we would go on to kind of the final. This is what I'm thinking. We meet next week, then I'm going to be in Montreal the 10th, and then maybe we'll have one summary session on the 17th, Saturday.
Of March?
Yeah, the 10th of March. I won't be here. Yeah. Okay. Again, let me just point out the interlocutors. There are four major interlocutors in this section on history. One is George Simmel, famous sociologist, teacher of Georgi Lukács. Another one is Heinrich Rickert, phenomenologist, in many ways, and so Wilhelm Dilthey, who we talked about last week, and the great Count, right? Yeah. So these are the four major interlocutors in this section that Heidegger is trying to go beyond, right? To think beyond. And another thing, conceptually, is there an eraser? Good. Yeah. Conceptually, Heidegger, through the question of temporality, because we're really dealing with historical time, and I like this with the way Althusser uses this. The chapter in Reading Capital, to me, one of the most important chapters of the Reading Capital group is Althusser's section on historical time. This was written in 1965. Yeah, historical time. But anyway, to go back to this. Heidegger is also critiquing this element in the Hegelian, that it is not the temporality. History is not the, quote, world historical unfolding of mind or spirit, as in Hegel. Okay? This is one of his antagonists, right? This Hegelian moment, right? And the book that Chris loaned me, Derrida, goes into this somewhat at length, right? I don't think he finishes the story, because Derrida will later write a book on Heidegger called Of the Spirit, of Geist. Yeah. So anyway, so keep this in mind. This is one of the conceptual things, as is, as you remember, durational time and flux, right? Because in this durational time, for him, it ends up that time becomes space and space becomes time. It's the spatialization of time. And this, again, is, to me, sometimes the problems that we get in Marxism, because everything is always about domination of space, taking of territory, right? We speak in these kind of terms, right? So it's kind of interesting that Heidegger would take this on. So you'll have the Bergson also in the section on the footnote, and in section 81 in Being in Time, the note on the note. Okay, so you have the historical time. So at one level the Geist, the other the durational time, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle. We have three antagonists really in terms of the history of time. Henri Bergson, Hegel himself, right, and Aristotle in terms of the physics, and a particular reading of chapter 10 of book 4 of the physics. I know I've said that before, but this is where, as you remember, the now is written as a point, a stigma, and Heidegger tries to bring together these two, right, and show some repeatability But for Hegel, the new term is Geist, as part of your historical time. You're reading the history of the spirit, the history of mind, the history of Geist, right? Which is a word that's been translated today by Jameson, interestingly enough, in his variations on Hegel, as community. He's now looking at the community, as a Geist. And this fits somewhat with Gramsci's notion of the common sense in terms of communis sensus and the building of a community of norms and established values, etc. Right? And I don't want to just lay it down like that, like a Dilthey would do, just a value formation. But it seems like Jameson is going back here to Geist, right, as community. Right? And Zeitgeist is not a possibility. Spirit of the times, right? I mean, you can talk about this. This may be part of, I like to frame this somewhat in orchestration. You could think of that as the rhythm of a time, but it's not ultimately the score, right? The zeitgeist, right? It can be a rhythm, a kind of, and the zeitgeist would be much more closer to elementary attunement, without the understanding, if you want to think of it that way too. Just trying to make some relations possible here for, to see this in a kind of open light. So remember, look, what he's really trying to do, once again, the intention here is within the destruction of ontology and the opening of the question of being, right, again, for Heidegger, is that he's got to go back and destroy the common philosophical notions about time. So he begins with the Aristotelian moment, right? And he's able to make a connection in terms of how he's going to develop the history of Western metaphysics, right? From Aristotle to Hegel. Remember with Heidegger, again, the whole tradition from Plato to Nietzsche is part of a Western metaphysical era. Right? This is the destiny of the West. The destiny of the West. One of the reasons I also say this is a book, the Da, is about orientation. This is how it tries to step outside, if you will, the dominant, philosophical tradition. Just reading, doing commentary, looking at philosophy as a concatenation of arguments. Heidegger's doing something even radically more different. He sees the concatenation of the arguments, right? From Aristotle to Hegel, and with a little bit of a passage through Bergson. At the same time, he doesn't want to really build an argument. He wants to think otherwise outside, right? And this is the reason for the existential analytic. This is where we begin, again, through Dasein.
Does he ever write
about
Presocratic?
Yes, he does. No, he has a very good seminar on Heraclitus with a man named Eugen Fink. It's a seminar they did after the war, and he does speak about the Presocratics. And he speaks about the Presocratics in many, most of the philosophical tradition, again, you have many levels in terms of doing philosophy. And one way of doing philosophy is doing the history of philosophy. And this is what Aristotle sort of started. He gives you a history of the Presocratics. He gives you a history of the Pythagoreans. He gives you, this is all going on, and Aristotle. Aristotle is sort of like your first historian of philosophy.
Does Heidegger write about the Presocratics?
Yes, that's where I was going. Yeah. So what Heidegger does, instead of writing a history of philosophy, is always trying to engage, quote, concepts and doing concepts in philosophy, right, as part of that history, right? It's always writing the concepts in history, which he actually appropriates somewhat from Rickert, who sees philosophy, and sees, historical time as a writing of concepts as well. This is very complicated, a lot of overlapping stuff, but it's a good question. So yes, he does speak about the Presocratics throughout because this is what the dialogue he wants to establish. Okay? I know I've mentioned this before. For Heidegger, the corruption begins with Plato and Aristotle. This is the massive corruption. further corrupted by the Latin language, right? So he wants to go back to something that we call direct intuition of the Presocratics. Direct intuition, which can only come through the there-ness of, the interrogator that has already been rendered transparent in terms of the relationship to that time. So the question of time here is to return, yes, to the Presocratics and the interior dialogue, what is meant by such a word like polemos in Heraclitus, strife or war, right? What is it meant by things, pragmata? What it is. Polemos, yes. This was the word that, the father of all things, polemos. In Greek it looks like that. Yeah, the polemos. So again, yes, we don't listen here, listening, if you will, to the Presocratics, maybe part of the narrative, right? And the two founding documents, and Josh knows this because he's read the Introduction to Metaphysics. I don't know if it's knowledge, it's more craft. But anyway, the Parmenidean being and the treatise on logical contradiction is linked up with Heraclitean flux, or becoming. So the whole history of the Presocratics, this is an interesting question. Is there being, question mark, and why does Heidegger put this, as Derrida wants to talk about, the double cross, or what most people call the erasure. Why is it under erasure, right, later in his thing? And then the question of becoming. And many people relate becoming as process that Heraclitus speaks to, whereas being is and is not, is the beginning of the origin of the logical contradiction in the history of philosophy with Parmenides, that both a thing can be and cannot be.
Is Hesiod really out of place?
You kind of understand this? I mean, this is dialectics at work. It's the is and the is not. Yeah, what?
What about Hesiod? Is he really out of place?
The historian.
He's he writes about the beginning of everything.
Yeah, I mean, he writes a book called The Theogony on the generation of the gods, right? This is the generation of the gods, and he talks about Chronos, Father Time, who devours his children. Zeus then castrates his father, Time, right? And becomes the head of the Olympians. And this is a very interesting narrative because once you begin to think about the Greek Olympians in a way, and you think this vis-a-vis, the three myths that we live under, and I kind of like this way of going about it, because myth means beginning in Greek. Muthein means to begin. So you don't have a beginning without myth. What's the myth of the left? No, honestly, I'm serious. What was the myth that carried the left forward, from the 19th century?
The French Revolution?
The general strike. Sorel. That was the myth, right? I mean, in a sense. It was George Sorel. Yeah, the myth of the general strike. That you could basically pull off a shutdown, right? And shut down labor, but withhold labor from capital. This was an action, a praxis, that went beyond critique of the modes of production or whatever. So you have those myths, right? And so anyway, the myths, the three myths, at least to me, the myth of Sisyphus, right? Prometheus, which is what Heidegger's still writing under. And the myth that Sticklers takes up, that of Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, who says we are the product of a default, because the gods were so fallible in the narrative, right, that they were unable to really give us the necessary techne when we needed it. Prometheus is the father of giving us, techne, craft, right? In so many ways. Sisyphus is the father of frustration and the absurdity of modern existence, right? In a sense. And we have the Sisyphean century where we get maybe a little bit close, but then we have to start again at square one. We go back to the quote-unquote drawing board all the time, right? Especially in radical circles. You're always starting at writing degree 0, point 0. How do we, articulate this? I mean, the best we're going to come up with, and, I'm going to get in trouble one day, but anyway, the Me Too movements, I mean, this is an aspect of feminism. I mean, give me a break, at this point, right? In a sense. So Epimetheus becomes the myth. This is where technics, and, the destiny of us has always been we're at fault. It's our verfallen, in Heideggerian terms, our falling prey is always already there, right? We're always already there in terms of this verfallen moment, this falling prey. Yeah. And if you want to think about this too, in terms of the addictogenic society, right? That, in a way, that fall, right, or that originary default is also part of how then we become addicted in a way determined by the techniques, that the tool, the quote episteme, determines us rather than our craft determining that. And it's this relationship that needs to be constantly thought between episteme, knowledge, right, and techne, craft, making, right? And this is, Stigler is very good at this, between the savoir-faire, we have forgotten this techne, knowing how to make, and at the same time in that knowing how to make, we have forgotten the know-how to live. Because you can't really know how to make, like Rachel knows how to cook a good steak, right? Without the practice of having, made it, right? In a sense, you just don't buy the meat. You just don't, you need a craft behind that. Our friend Arun Gupta, who's an exceptional cook. If you ever read his, you've had food from Arun?
Yeah, he's a Facebook friend, and he makes a lot of pictures of what he's cooking.
Yeah. Well, we'll get Arun to cook for us one day. He's very good.
Yeah,
I'll get Arun.
Love that.
Yeah.
Isn't Sisyphus part of the addictogenic?
Tell me why you would say that. Tell me.
Why is he rolling up the rock? I mean, that's a stupid question.
No, it's not especially a stupid question. Why would he do that, right?
Why does he need to roll the rock up?
Well, that's the struggle. That's the struggle of man against the earth, right? In a certain way, that's where the strife and the polemics is always working. This relationship to the mountain and to the valley, if you will.
The first architect.
Yes, in a lot of ways, he is the first architect. Yes, that's true. It's interesting. Yeah. And it's also about labor. I mean, this is the myth of labor. Marx is about the myth of Prometheus. That was the patron saint to Marx. Marx is still caught within, quote unquote, at least a Stiglerian mindset, and probably to Heidegger to a degree, still within the Promethean Western model. And remember, look, I'm trying to, give you a much broader perspective, if you will. I mean, you don't have to buy this, but I'm trying just to open it up in a way. In the beginning of the 19th century, you have Kant and Hegel. You have a German Enlightenment that's pretty powerful, the Aufklärung, right? That goes back and really reinvents Greece, reinvents this Greek world. And everybody is educated under this, including all these four people, including Edmund Husserl, including Sigmund Freud, including Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels. So these are all, Friedrich Engels had courses with Schelling in Germany. He was educated in Germany. Yeah. So, I mean, this is another thing. You have a kind of new ancient model that is playing out. And this is very well articulated. I mean, not to where I want to take it, but he actually sets the stage in Black Athena, Martin Bernal. Yeah, it kind of sets the stage for this. And this is the beginning, and Heidegger in a way is certainly educated, but he's the first, proto, if you will, destroyer of, how this all came down. He's looking at it and saying, but we're really not at that level of the direct intuition and what this culture was really thinking back then. This is part of his goal, right? In a way, yeah, always. And Derrida, who never said that you're just going to step outside and get to the point of where you're going to escape at metaphysics. He knew you had to work through this. So we're always in this position, and unfortunately it's so much work, but it's good work, I think, to me, where you're remembering, you're repeating, and you're working through. So you have the memory, the politics of memory always working. You have the politics of repetition, right? And the creation of forms, right? And then there's always the politics of what is one willing to undergo? What is the experiential? What is really being learned? How do you become an agent of learning? So this kind of remembering, repeating and working through, is a very important kind of formula, if you will, for engaging this. So what Heidegger wants to do, and going back to where we started back in October and November, again, this term, wieder Holung, to haul along, right, which is really strong repetition. It's not psychic automism here. There's a difference. Psychic automism is trigger stuff. You're triggered into reacting a certain way. You're triggered by some emotion, and then you automatically go into some kind of spin, tailspin or whatever, going forward. And this is a thing that, David probably knows. In the 19th century, psychic automism was always talked about, particularly around Charcot, Pinel, and other psychiatrists, right? And then, what were you going to say?
No, I'm just trying to remember.
Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, yeah. So you have this kind of psyche or psychic automism, right? And this is like trigger points that are, making you react and repeat. That's horrendous, that's horrible. That reminds me, you're going to these kind of things. Whereas this Wiederholung, the repetition that I'm talking about, is an active process that also is connected to, in the Platonic sense, this is right, which is basically to recollect. You're recollecting something. You're always recollecting through a repetitious moment. So it's remembering, repetition, right, and working through. And the working through is part of the lived experience, out of which, at least to my mind, comes real learning. This is where you begin to really learn the lesson. This is where agency really is in terms of learning. You have a question? Okay. Yeah. So I don't know, hopefully this helps in a way. So Heidegger would see this, if you repeat this versus time, et cetera, that he has, he's trying to get outside of this kind of spiraling type of time in history, right? Where you have these dialectical sequences, right? And dialectical moments that go with spiraling, so you open up, I'm very bad at drawing, I'm sorry. But you're opening up spherically to the next, right? To the next stage, right? You're always, kind of coming around into the next. And that the mind is structured in such a way, and history is structured in such a way, that through these spirals, almost like Gothic cathedrals, right? You begin to, unfold world history, right? In many ways. And you begin to see the transitions, right? Between, eras, periods, etc., right? And concepts going through. And I don't think that Heidegger's really denying Hegel. I think he's trying to work with him, but saying this is not enough for another kind of historicality. This is where he's trying to go, that the temporality itself is somewhat flawed, at least in the way he sees temporality. Now, another thing is, in Hegel, you certainly have anxiety. The angst is in the master-slave dialectic, that you presented on, last year. This famous section in consciousness and self-consciousness in the phenomenology. So in the master-slave, or what I would call more, it's more directly lordship and bondage. I think it's more powerful when you start talking about it that way, because he uses the word more like the helper who's in bondage, right? I mean, a slave, but slave is also Slavic, there are many connotations around that. In some ways, he's talking about, that the temporality of the helper or of the bondage is always indebted to that of the master. It's an interiorization of the master. So when we talk about language such as sellout in a Hegelian way, we're talking about those who, sell out through delay, right, to the master. I have no choice but to compromise under capital, right?
Because he won't risk death.
Because he won't risk death and he won't risk the anxiety. That's correct.
Which is Heidegger picks up with fleeing death.
Yes, exactly. So that's there, right? But Heidegger will see this much more in terms of subjectivity rather than a dialectic of history, right, in this way, right? More of a politics of self, world, and care that's going on, rather than a struggle to the death between, although he's well aware of the struggle to death, there's no question about it. And remember, this temporality in Heidegger is always future, right? We're always placed into the future. Our having beenness is future, right? Okay. Yes, please. No, go ahead. Yeah, no problem.
Maybe I should wait.
No, it's okay. Read what you brought.
I'm sure you.
Oh yeah.
Yes, but
Rory wants
I
to
wanted
intervene
share
here.
with-
Yeah.
No, 'cause- can I read one passage?
Yes, of course.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I think it's related also. When the mountain broke in night, stillness tells of its plunging over the waters, and then oldest of the all follows behind us, now thinking, and yet it comes to meet us. Now I was thinking about
Comes to meet us.
Yeah, it's similar to what you said
Right,
about temporality.
Right.
Sorry again.
What is that?
It's
It's Heidegger's poem.
Heidegger's poem. I just
Oh,
want
okay.
to.
He wrote poetry.
I thought it
This
was
is
really
great.
good.
Oh, I think we have this one. No, we don't.
Sorry to bring this up.
No,
Just
it's
wanted to
very
share.
good. No. The thinking will meet you, right?
Wait, what page is that?
It was maybe. Sorry to.
The gods have disappeared, right? And what else does he say? The thinking has not arrived yet.
Yeah, and
Like-
yeah.
I mean, for Heidegger, really, look, I know it's a very radical thing, and maybe you may think, I think it's a very humble thing to say of him, but I mean, that's the way I read him, I mean, and you can also consider, he's much more arrogant in the, the 20s than he is in the 60s, believe me. But anyway, I think, again, for Heidegger, it's really about, we have not yet begun to think. It's the end of philosophy. We have limited philosophy. Philosophy is at a stage of closing time. This is what we learn from this section, I think, and also in history. It's closing time. It's not only end of history, but it's a closing time of the representations of history, right? Closing time of the representations of history. Right? And we have not yet begun to think, in this moment. That's the task of thinking. It's no longer philosophy, doing commentary, doing history of philosophy, etc. That working through the past, yes, of course, is going to, maybe free us in terms of the future, antérieur, make us more futural, will bring great anxiety with it. But at the same time, we are abandoned to freedom. I like this phrase I used last week. I was thinking about that. I mean, I think it's a decent phrase. Instead of condemned to be free, like Sartre says, we're abandoned to freedom in Heidegger. We have that abandonment, and either we flee from the responsibility of that freedom in the being towards death, or we accept it and we engage it, and then we take upon ourselves that anxiety. Because that's who we are, according to him. We're not our, quote, ethnic, racial makeup, right? This is not who we are, really. We're really, anxious towards the future. Being towards death yields this anxiety towards the future. Yeah.
How much it's like waiting for Godot. in
Yes, it
the
is. Well, it's
future.
obviously the Beckett and them come out of this.
It's
You know,
so
I mean, that's
much
what-
like it,
yes.
waiting for Godot.
The emphasis is on the waiting.
Waiting and.
Not the
and-
Godot. Forget Godot.
Well, he never appears.
Forget Godot. I'm telling you, forget Godot. Just the waiting for, or the waiting on.
Yeah,
both
but
prepositions.
He never appears, and I think Beckett pronounced it Godot.
Yes, he did.
But
And in French, it's on the waiting is emphasized, whereas in English, we lose the waiting. It's
En
on
attendant.
attendant. Got
En
it?
attendant.
Yeah.
Godot.
Got it. Got it.
But Ponzi and Lucky come by, and Ponzi says to Lucky, "Think, pig," which is the end. You know, suggests that it's the end of thinking, or the master slave, and the slave
Well,
thinks.
sure. But it's interesting that Lucky is the one who does the deconstruction of empiricism. You know, it's very famous. I don't know, you're familiar with Waiting for Godot? There's this wonderful section where Lucky, you know, basically, you know, destroys Bishop Berkeley and the English empiricists. A wonderful little, you know, play,
Yeah.
you know, within the play. Yeah. Ham and clove, right? And Endgame, right? Did I, and Go-Go.
Estragon and Didi.
Estragon and Didi, right?
Ponzo and Lucky.
Yeah,
Ponzo, yeah, I think so.
yeah, Ponzo, yeah.
But it's all toward futurity, which
Yes,
never
of
comes.
course, never comes, yeah. And you know, you begin to look at the literature. I mean, I like playing with the titles in a way because they give you an indication, you know, and you know, you can go into depth and say what did the title really signify to the content of the book. But you know, you have The Madness of the Day by Maurice Blanchot, you know, in which, you know, everydayness and its madness are incorporated. You know, you have Journey to the End of the, to the Journey to the End of the Night by Celine,
Celine.
right? So all of these moments are very much within this kind of philosophical register, you know, illustrations, if you will, of this Heideggerian, you know, not to say he's the father of all, I'm not trying to go there, but again, this book and its resonation, you know, among art, among, you know, literature, among all these, you know, groups is very, very important, very, very important to keep in mind. And especially the thing being towards death, because, you know, we are, you know, this is something that we stop at, you know, and I'm trying to craft it now, this whole notion of the Americanization of death that has taken over. You know, everything's a statistic, everything's a tragedy, everything but death and dying, what it means. Everything but death.
That's interesting.
You know, this is kind of how I see it, and how this has encapsulated the world, right, in a way.
Have you read Jessica Mitford?
Years ago, I may reread Jessica Mitford. Yeah, that's good advice. Yes, the American way of death. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Where does Nietzsche fit in all this?
Well, for Heidegger, Nietzsche, in terms of the way he does the history of philosophy, this new history of being, Nietzsche is the last great final blow in terms of the end of Western metaphysics. The trajectory is from Plato to metaphysics, right? Traditional systematic is from Aristotle to Hegel. I've been thinking about this a little bit. It's more Plato to Nietzsche, and then it's Aristotle to Hegel, or the two narrative moments in terms of the history of philosophy for Heidegger. But it's really from Plato to Nietzsche that he's really thinking about. And this is the end of Western metaphysics. This is one of the reasons Derrida, at the end of the Ends of Man essay that you have in the book that you have there, is you know, that the Heideggerian hope, you know, does not really account for the Übermensch who can go to the open sea. And there's a lot of talk about this. I mean, obviously, and I think about this, is the Nietzschean horizon, the open horizon of which we are completely unknown, right? A much more radical moment, right, than the Heideggerian future anterior. You know, this is a question. And what, you know, is it possible to escape in a certain way, right? this dominance of the Western metaphysical tradition without working through it completely. And does Nietzsche actually exceed it? Does he really exceed that project? These are very dense, very difficult questions.
Yeah.
But certainly markers that we think under, in a way. Because if Nietzsche's correct, we're not tabula rasa, but we're going into the unknown completely, and which is much more scarier, right, than the having beenness reaching you in the future, going forward. So, Nietzsche's kind of like on the high seas, whereas Heidegger's in the mountains, right, in a way. So you have, it's kind of interesting when you begin to think about this in terms of navigational metaphors versus metaphors of the earth and the mountain, God's earth. Nietzsche doesn't speak this way. He speaks of horizons and of the sea, the open sea. He loves the open sea.
Which book he talks about these issues?
All. It's throughout. But the Twilight of the Idols is a great beginning deconstruction. We looked at that, when we did Nietzsche, if you remember, and then of course the Genealogy of Morals was really would take care of in 1 second the Me Too movement, and 1 second. Yeah, that's all you need. One flash on that. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So it's interesting in a sense. Yeah. I don't mean to belittle the Me Too serious part of it. I really don't. I understand it's a very serious component to it. I just think it's gotten to the point of absurdity when you start talking about taking Balthus out of museums. And that's Pierre Kloskowski's brother.
That's not the Me Too, though. That was...
No, it is. It is Me Too. They said
because I posted a Balthus on Facebook.
They haven't gone after you, Chris? They're going to come. They're going to come hard. We'll defend you. Don't worry.
You know Babette Badin?
I do know Babette.
She attacked me for it.
She's totally crazy.
There's a petition
She's
to
smart.
remove the Balthus Therese Dreaming from the Met because of the 12-year-old in the painting.
Yeah.
So people are trying to bring it down, and there's a huge argument about
Well,
it.
she really went after me and said I was promulgating the male gaze.
Right her back and said, I thought you liked Stanley very much. She followed Stanley around. She came to the thing, she
So
could follow
what's the
him.
painting they want to remove?
Therese Dreaming is of the 12-year-old girl by Balthus.
By Baltimore.
Yeah, Balthus.
Yeah,
Isn't it the one with the red?
Camus loved
You know
cat,
this
with the
one.
cat.
Yeah.
who's the brother of Pierre Kloskowski, and you want to get a Me Too moment in, just think what he did
Yeah,
with his
with
wife,
Me Too
those
with
drawings,
Kloskowski, yeah.
and the bondage of his
Right.
wife too, right? Yeah, completely sexist in today's language, but not at all, but anyway.
I wonder how she'd feel
Yeah, that's
about
correct.
Nabokov's
They're trying to pull
Lolita.
this out. Take it.
Probably
they're
not
trying to
good.
remove it from the map.
Or Roman Polanski, get her started on that.
Yeah, I read something that,
She doesn't comment on anything anymore that
Yeah,
I
I know,
post.
sexually explicit.
Okay.
I don't know what.
But you're in good company, she's already
I mean-
broken with Peter Francis and that.
Really?
Yeah. She complained about Peter to me. I said, no, the bad, we'll let it go,
Jeez.
Because he didn't post her stuff. Yeah, anyway. But anyway, going back, it's a good question. What about Nietzsche? Not Hitler, but what about Nietzsche? The guy that raises his hand. What about Nietzsche in all of this? Yeah, this is the master thinker, in a way. But you have to remember, he succumbs, like Hölderlin, like several others during the 19th century, including Rimbaud, who, the vision is too great. He succumbs to something, whether it's physiological, whether it was syphilis or not, it's still on the path to madness, right? And we have this. And it's, Marx did not go mad. Heidegger did not go mad. Hegel did not go mad, right? In a sense. So there is something to be said. I love the mad, really, in some ways. I'm not, but in a way, this kind of thinking, right, systematic thinking and systematic deconstruction, there's something to be said for it. Even though Nietzsche is very systematic too, once you read all of his work and you begin to put it into, multiple things. See, for Nietzsche, the time, to go back to this, is that, when we speak, this word, repetition, right? It's eternal recurrence of the same. But this sets up a very interesting dynamic in play. This is why Heidegger may think this way, because in Plato, you have, is it going to be the reproduction of the same, right? The same images, right? Or will it be other? So this is a very old story in Plato, right? So this is where the eternal
This is just
recurrence
the cave.
of the same is really happening. Yes, yes.
From the cave?
Yeah, partially from the cave, and this is the whole thing of the image in the cave and the silhouette
Okay.
and this birth, etc. In the cave, right? Swimming up the cave. And I gave you the diagram, right,
Yeah.
of this in some ways, right? Yeah, yeah. But I mean, this is going on all throughout Plato, same
Where
and
else?
other, as is speech and writing, as is what's the difference between the sophist, who's an expert itinerant thinker of formal argumentation, versus that of the philosopher, who is seeking dialectically towards the truth, or in Badiou's sense, the true idea, that I put up alongside of the Platonic good. Right, so this is very, very dense. I mean, it's worthy of a lot of thinking. Very, very dense. But yeah, so Nietzsche, in terms of temporality, right, and history has, as you know from reading the uses and abuses of history, or the advantages and disadvantages of history. He has the three categories: the antiquarian, the monumental, and the critical. Right? And these are the three ways of doing well, which Foucault takes up very well in terms of the archaeology, the archaeology of the present, right? He wants to do history this way. At the same time, he's also thinking through this eternal recurrence of the same, that Nietzsche himself wanted to get mathematized. He went to the university after he came up with his thoughts, right? And says, we can mathematize and figure out history this way. So Lacan was not the only one wanting to do these extremely ambitious projects with mathematics. It goes way back, in some ways, right? The perfection, figuring out exactly how everything works. I mean, that's what the striving is for. At the same time, simultaneously, Nietzsche is actually, asking the question, do things repeat themselves constantly in history? So Marx, of course, as you know, also has a kind of eternal recurrence in a way. But, first time as tragedy,
Right.
these things appear. First Ronald Reagan, now as farce, Donald Trump. If you want to read history this way, in terms of the production of images, right? In terms of the production of the spectacle, right? Yeah. Now the content is a little different. Yeah. Even though it's extended, right? In some ways. So he has this thing. Whereas in Heidegger, again, it's the future, it's the horizon, right? It's the futural horizon, being able to think in terms of horizontal, positions, right? Yeah? The verticality is being slashed here. There's a vertical horizontal relationship in Hegel's spirals. In Heidegger, it's almost purely horizontal. Dasein, the there beingness, right? Dasein is actually articulated within the horizon of temporality, not under the verticality or the other thing. So remember this, it's always the horizontal for Heidegger. And he's looking, again, not a search for origins, but going back to your question about the Presocratic, to the originative moment. Originative meaning, again, this German word that doesn't really have a great English translation. I'm using originative, Ursprung, which literally could be springing forth. How does something emerge? In Badiou's, in Sticklers' language, eventization in a certain way as
And
part of it.
Derrida says, the
Primary word.
original word.
Yeah, the original word, yeah. He's looking for, between the Ursprung, and you also have the Lord. Right. Yeah. So, And to read in between this with Heidegger too, historically, you have to see that art and techne are always very, very important to history. You know, this is really what the future is about. It's, you know, Heisenberg and Clay in 1962, right? Indeterminacy and what was it, The Saints at the Window that Paul Clay, he comments on, I think it is. I think it's The Saints at the Window. And not Angelus Novus. See, for Benjamin, the image of history is Angelus Novus.
Looking backward.
Yes. Yeah.
Looking back at the catastrophe of.
The catastrophe, the ruins of history. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, Heidegger, the catastrophe, right? Another good Greek word. You cut from the strophe, right? Okay. You know, is the catastrophe is the way Western philosophy and Western metaphysics has structured things. The catastrophe is domination over nature. The fusus has been dominated. This is why the ecologists like it so much, particularly Arne Naas. Arne Naas is completely influenced by Heidegger. You know. And Kiefer's relations too, when Kiefer does stuff with earth and ground is
There's a show at the Breuer now, the Keeper.
Yes, I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah, big
And there's one in Philly. Have you seen it?
I haven't gone this
Okay.
week.
I mean, I'll show you. There's a very good book by Matthew Barrow. I mean, of course, I'm not going to buy it, but I did photocopy it. It has many images of the relationship of Heidegger and Kiefer. Right. Yeah. I'm not going to buy it. I just, I take advantage of the LIU equipment sometimes.
We have a book on Heidegger and Kiefer.
What's that?
We have a book on Heidegger.
Is it by Matthew Barrow from Cambridge? About 250 pages.
Yeah, it's an odd-sized book.
It's an Oxford book?
No, it's odd-sized. It's like doesn't.
Well, I understand that, but who's the public? You don't remember?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Let me know who the author
I'll
is.
bring
I
it.
mean, yeah.
It's pretty big. Though.
Yeah. There's this relationship. He had a very, very close relationship with George Braque, the sculptor. Yeah, very, very close relationship early on. And who else? There was another guy, Greuthausen. You know Greuthausen? Bernhard Greuthausen is a Swiss artist, I think was the other one he had very close relations with. Yeah. So anyway, again, think about it. I mean, another way of thinking about this is, Heidegger's also, when you begin to think of the quote Jewish Holocaust, right, in this sense, in a way, that you have to ask the question, why would Paul Celan want to go see him, about history and what being is, in a sense, because, what's being repeated, right, in history, right? What does the future really do? I don't know if you've read Paul Celan's poem, right, on Death is a Master from Germany. Yeah. It's one of the famous lines, since we're dealing with this section, Death is the Master from Germany. Yeah. And he talks about signing the book in the Black Forest, inscribing his name in the book to go see Heidegger at the hut. Right. Interesting. So anyway, yeah. But you're right. I mean, listen, one of the ways I think that, quote unquote, this whole question of psychopathology should be treated is that you have to begin with the existential question of being towards death.
Towards death.
Yes. If you only begin at castration anxiety, which is the bedrock of Freudian psychoanalysis, you're really missing something in terms of temporality.
That's
I think.
true, yeah.
I really think so. I think this is one real advance that's been given us, in a way. If you begin to think about, this and experience, that it becomes part of your lived experience, that, mortality and natality and your history is, held within this instead of the, it's daddy, mommy, me triangulations all the time and transferences that went on. I think you're in a very different opening in one's life, in a lot of ways. But the existential psychoanalytic as Sartre wanted to deal with it. Because, well, Sartre wanted to deal with it in terms of choice. You know, the project and choice are very important in the making of the person, right? In the making of the, you know, the life, right?
Yeah, in terms of drive theory, Freud moved towards the death instinct is, you know.
Yes, the death drive,
Death
the
drive.
drive, not the
Yeah.
instinct.
No,
It
death
wasn't
drive.
an instinct, it was a
Right.
triba. Yeah.
It's a
And-
later edition after.
yes, I mean, he wrote the book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, right? And yeah. But it was still a drive. It was something that's not, quote unquote, temporal in terms of futural, you know, as Heidegger will describe it. Right? I mean, there's similarities. I hear you, and I mean, I told you the story about death drive and being towards death, right? I didn't tell you that story
Yeah.
about Lacan and his two wives? Didn't I?
Sorry.
Yeah, I didn't, yeah.
No, I don't remember.
That Lacan was, you know, driving Heidegger in his Jaguar around Paris, and Lacan was known to speed through Paris, was a maniac, you know, with road rage and everything, supposedly. And Mrs. Heidegger, Elfrida, and Sylvie Lacan, Sylvie Bataille Lacan, are in the back seat. And Mrs. Heidegger whispers to Sylvie, "Can you tell the good doctor to slow down? They're going a little bit too fast." And Heidegger's sitting shotgun, so anyway, Sylvie whispers to the good doctor, "Mrs. Heidegger wants you to slow down." Of course, Lacan speeds up. Right? So the story is, and Heidegger just sits there very stoically. So being towards death stoically reacts to the death drive. Or in the death drive. It's kind of a little story. Yeah, anyway. But yeah, no, it's different though in Freud because he's still bound to Helmholtzian physics, right? And he's still looking at this in terms of scientific categories. Yeah. So kind of keep that in mind. I'm very fond of Freud. And, you know, Rachel and Josh saw my latest very nice thing. I've got a nice, beautiful photograph of Freud in his study given to me by
This is a really nice picture.
beautiful picture. Yeah.
Can you get more of those pictures?
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about it later.
Yeah, we'll talk about it.
Can you just scan it for him?
Yeah.
High resolutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has a drum scanner.
Yeah, they are.
Eros and Thanatos.
It's a very nice photo.
That's great. I
Yeah.
want one.
I like the Medusa outside of the office. Yeah. Like the head of Medusa. Yeah. Anyway.
He also has them interacting, and he says basically, Eros puts up a good fight, but even though in the end Thanatos has to win, but you know, it's.
Well, that's always the struggle
Yes,
of creativity,
struggle.
right? I mean, this is why, you know, in a way, you know, people, I mean, we admire tremendously our modern, really, heroes in a way beyond the, you know, the guerrilla warfare of the Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara, et cetera, are really those who have struggled to put their work, you know, into creative works. I mean, this is really it. I mean, it's very hard to be creative in this world, you know, in a systematic, consistent way, right? I mean, it's very, very hard to
Cave paintings.
to do the arrows. Where are you going there
The
for?
cave paintings
Yeah.
in I forget what town in France.
Oh, yeah.
Lascaux is one.
Where?
Lascaux is one.
Lascaux.
That's not.
Cave
Yeah,
paintings.
yeah. So it's very interesting in the sense of, you know, that we have this kind of great admiration. And this is another notion, I think, of the Nietzschean Übermensch as applied to art. I mean, you know, that the highest stage is the creator, right? Yeah, this is really what, you know, and the whole thing of the Apollonian Dionysian too, the plastic and spatial arts, you know, versus that of the more, you know, primitive, you know, if you will, you know, arts, yeah.
It's
So,
interesting.
and Freud, of course, you know, the kind of crucial category, as Hilda Doolittle said about it, what dreamy German dreamed up of this concept in his study, sublimation, right? You know, so, you know, we admire these levels of sublimation, this kind of creativity. Because it's very hard for Eros to win, as you say, you know, because you're always in that struggle. It's much easier to destroy. It's much easier to be self-destructive, much easier to be destructive, to be kind of passive in these situations, etc. But to really be creative and to continue at that level is really a task. I mean, enormous amounts of energy, you know, required, and to stand on that line, so to speak. And you see Heidegger and Junger's ready to jump, right? The Dionysian Heidegger in some ways, wait a minute, we better study it for a while. So there are all these, kind of, yeah. This is what Althusser said about Derrida. He was the philosopher of our times because he's the only one pushing the limit. This is what Althusser had to say about Derrida later on in life, which is interesting that he's always working at the limit. Yeah. I mean, I think Foucault in another way was working at the limit. That depends, Yeah. But it's interesting because Derrida is always risking the throw of the die. Yeah. And that's another thing that happens in terms of the being towards best. What is one willing to risk beyond calculation? I mean, we hear all this stuff today, and Heidegger would be, astonished. Not really. He would say this is all part of the epoch, right? that all the risk calculation. You know how this works on Wall Street, insurance agencies, everything in life. Where you go to school, how long you take to finish, your projects, your degree, all this kind of stuff. It's all based on risk management. It's not based on risk. It's not based on taking chances, in a certain way, in a lot of ways, or creating chances. And in philosophy, Eros is the guiding principle. That is the guide, is Eros. Eros is always there, and this is what the symposium really is about, in Plato,
The Nietzschean aesthetics is in the book on Wagner, or
The aesthetics?
Yeah,
I think
does
it's
he really
all
have
over
one?
his work.
He doesn't really have
I don't think he really writes. He does not. This is not a traditional kind of thing where they wrote aesthetics, etc. I mean, Heidegger dealt with questions of epistemology, as does Nietzsche. Same thing with aesthetics. Heidegger's great books. Great articles on aesthetic art and space. The origin of the work of art, right? Or two of his great. Is art and space in there?
No, it's only the origin of the work of art.
Yeah. And so he deals with this, and he has his objects, the choice of objects. In Nietzsche's case, philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks sort of sets up the aesthetics of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and that the tragic age, that philosophy is a downward moment from tragedy. From tragedy. And that's another thing, speaking of going back to this Americanization of death, at least to my mind again, is that we don't really look at tragedy anymore. We don't risk it because we're afraid of tragedy, in a certain way. Unlike, I'm not saying you go out and seek out tragedies, but the question is we have kind of this, to put it in the title of a book that George Steiner wrote, The Death of Tragedy, right? No longer do we have this amor fatum, this love of fate, what the hand was dealt us, so to speak, and then how to play it, right? This is what politics is really about in a certain way. How do you play, the hand that was dealt you? How do you really
According
begin
to Aristotle, you have in tragedy a hero who is superior to the average man.
Yes.
He's noble.
Well, there's a class thing there.
And I wonder if part of our problem today is we don't have any of those people left.
Well, you can look at the tragedies on the left. Malcolm X was a noble. In fact, there was I remember in the 80s when there was an attempt to kind of neutralize things. There was an article in the cover of Esquire, Malcolm X, the Black Aristocrat, right? You have this kind of stuff going on,
But there's not many,
Well, no, but there were many Oedipuses and Electras and Orestes back in the day
eulogize Billy Graham.
I'm
you
not
can't make a tragedy out of Billy Graham.
Not me.
That's nice.
I'm taking the shovel, taking the great tragedy.
You saw where the coffins were made?
The good die young.
You see where the coffins being made?
No.
Angola State Penitentiary in
Oh.
Louisiana.
For Graham?
Yes. He had a program there, a ministry, very close to a lot of the inmates. And he put in his will that he wants his coffin made by labor from Angola, who they have made coffins before for the Graham ministry. Can you imagine? And they've been very receptive to his message. And this is in Angola. Now, I know Panthers who were in Desire Street from the 70s that are still in Angola. There's a guy named Wilfred Rideau. You remember they got a poker board here because he had a newspaper, an internal prison newspaper called the Angola.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Leonard Woodcock just got out.
Leonard Woodcock just got out. Yeah, I've been to Angola. I haven't been in. I mean, as an inmate, but I've been there. Dr. John has been there. Dr. John has been there. I've been an inmate, and as the one, what they call OP. What do they call it? OPP, Orleans Parish Prison. Yeah, not just a few days. I called my father. He told me to stay there. This was from the activity at the campus, right? Anyway, but anyway. But Angola is a rough place. I mean, alligator
I've read
farm.
James Lee Burke on.
Oh, you read James Lee Burke? Yeah,
Sure.
he's a character. You like Robichaud?
Oh yes.
Okay, good.
Very much.
Yeah. I got to introduce you if he ever comes to the left forum to Costas Douzinos.
To what's her name? Alastair Burke.
Yeah,
His daughter writes mysteries.
yeah, she writes mysteries. Yeah. No, he's a character. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Great novels.
Yeah. Very formulaic, but pretty good.
Well, what's the fat guy's name that his Falstaff?
Not Robichaud, but the other character. I forgot his name, but it's a Cajun name. Yeah. Well, Dr. John McRabenik is, also Cajun. In some ways, yeah. But he was very early on in his career. I think spent a little time at Angola. But yeah, Billy Graham. I mean, this is amazing, huh? They have this whole business of coffin making in the worst state penitentiary in the United States.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And Kissinger's still alive.
That politicizes. You can get him at a Yankee game if you want.
Oh, Kissinger?
Yeah. You just make sure you don't bring in metal and do it a different way.
The
Yeah.
good die young, and the evil they stay alive.
Younger, maybe Younger was evil in the beginning. Lived to be 103.
They make a lot of stuff in prison.
Yeah, cheese for Whole Foods.
Victoria's Secret.
Yeah.
All of the furniture in the DMV.
They
Yeah.
get posters with
Yeah.
they get posters with that. That's not stupid by capitalism. They got that
Yeah.
guy they got
Guys making
that part
bras?
down.
Oh yeah. In
Yeah.
fact, the ones that broke out, remember a few years ago, there was a big breakout and they were making bras in the prison. That was their job. Remember there was a woman that broke them out?
Yeah.
And they make their
It's a good question for Tom Brady the next time he loses the Super Bowl for his model wife, right? Who was one of the stars,
Asking if he
Victoria.
wants to make bronze.
No, what about the bra making of the prison, culture? Like,
But those benches in the DMV, slave labor.
yeah, no, it's huge slave labor. Yeah, we know that, right? Yeah.
I think they also make uniforms for like the
Pinkerton?
MTA, that's right.
MTA?
uniforms
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
slave labor.
You're not going to get that out of Bill de Blasio talking about that, right? Another guy. Anyway, okay, so maybe we should go to the text, just to see how he's doing this. I mean, any questions? About the sections or thoughts? I mean, it doesn't have to be questions. Any comments, commentary? Either chapter 5 on temporality and historicity, and again, I know we went over this somewhat, and then of course the sections 50, 51, 52. Again, he's operating, and you can see the patterns here. He's going to work with the existential, right, and the ontological structure, right? And then he'll go on in terms of the everydayness, right? And then, of course, the totality of the existential concept of death. And I think I put this in the earlier, in the diagram. Maybe a little part of the diagram, I think. Let me look at that. See if I have it with me today. I'm not sure I do. But yeah, some of the sections here on, again. I mean, if you look at the diagram again, we're now in the section of the self, in relation to care, and of course to world, because we're reading it in terms of triads, right? And now we're beginning the disclosedness and everydayness of existence, right? It's only through everydayness and the rendering of the, Dasein transparent, who becomes the investigator or the interrogator, that we begin to get this disclosedness, this uncovering, of structures, right, etc. And then you have possibilities of fleeing and inauthenticity, right? That is basically underlied by dread and by angst, right? Simultaneously, you begin to see operating idle talk, gossip, right? This discourse and dictatorship of the they self, of the publicness happening as well, right? That you're closed off, in terms of the inauthenticity, right? And, you're again falling prey instead of overcoming the anxiety or the angst or encountering the angst, right? Going forward. Okay, so this is what's happening here. And, what comes out of inauthenticity sometimes in idle talk instead of real conversation is what we get in communication today. Assertion and communication. And for Heidegger, again, the outgrowth of all of this, or the result, is that we, after this Western metaphysical tradition, right, we end up in the cybernetic age. And this is, of course, where Derrida begins telegrammatology. Derrida is very well aware of all this stuff. Yeah. Yeah. This is where Western metaphysics has led. This is the destiny of Western metaphysics, is the cybernetic. No longer not thinking. Thinking would have to be outside of this. Right? So this is quite a task. Right? The cybernauts in the ancient were the navigators on the boats. The cybernauts. They're the ones who directed the oar movement. Kind of interesting word, right? Now, in the United States, post-World War II, just to go a little bit to the side here, is that Norbert Wiener writes a book called The Human Use of Human Beings. Very crucial book to the construction of the social sciences and the constructions of many of the computer science programs, from Caltech to MIT and the whole Silicon Valley. Norbert Wiener. You know his name? You don't know his name. Very crucial person. One of his good friends was Lawrence Kuby, psychoanalyst. You know who Lawrence Kuby was, right? And then also another good friend was Gregory Bateson. You know, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. So, anyway, these become the new figures, and this actually feeds, say, a book like Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, where Lyotard begins to talk about the age of information technologies, right? 1979 is a report on knowledge to Quebec, not published in the United States till 94, and then very, very poorly understood, in my opinion. But anyway, in which he puts out the proposition that all we have now is exchange value and information. It's not really a beast.
Baudrillard said that we only have exchange value and we don't have use value.
Well, Lyotard says this in 79 vis-a-vis information technologies in a report on knowledge.
79?
79. I mean, I don't know if they're on the simulacra, in a way, which is
I
a
can
platonical.
show you
I believe you. I like his book, The Political Economy of the Sign, and I also like his book, what's the other one?
Simulacra.
Well, the simulacras go to the political economy of the sign is a kind of very interesting attempt to look at materialist semiotics in Marxian political economy. Very good book. There are two great books on semiotics in the Marxist tradition. One is The Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign by Jean Baudrillard, and the other one is a book called, what is it called? Towards the Semiotics of Labor, for Fernando Ruccio Lundi. Lundi Rossi, I'm sorry, Lundi Rossi, right? Semiotic homology of labor. I think it's Ferruccio. Yeah. This is probably a fortune on Amazon. But anyway, really great book. And then Baudrillard's Political Economy of the Sign. And yes, the Simulacra. And then there's a book by Jean-Joseph Gouault, Symbolic Exchange, Lacanian, an attempt to merge Lacan with Marx, called Symbolic Exchange. Yeah. And he was a good friend of Derrida's. It was kind of marginal to the Telltale group. Yeah. So, yeah, you may be right. I mean, this was part of the whole culture at that time, you know, in a sense. But the interesting thing is, after World War II, you know, and there's very little talk about this. Wiener, Bateson, Cuby, among others, including Talcott Parsons, all get together, and this is part of the government at work, right? And talk about, you know, how this new computer age will function, right? And what we want in terms of control, etc. Right? So you're bringing in an anthropologist, a cybernetic theoretician, a psychoanalyst, a sociologist, you know, and they all become part of, you know, this government, you know, research council, social science research council that begins to construct the disciplines. And this is why C. Wright Mills is important. C. Wright Mills was an outsider. He rebelled against this, the power elite. Yeah, but it's good to know what they're rebelling against, so you don't get into repeating the past in a bad way, right? It's always good to know what they're really rebelling against. Why did Mills emerge the way he did? What was he fighting? What was he coming up against? This was part of it. But this is a very interesting book, The Human Use of Human Beings. You know, Cybernetics in Society is the full name of the book by Wiener. So Heidegger says this is the era we live in, and those of you that have read Only a God Can Save Us Now, Heidegger says we live in the age of cybernetics. This is the metaphysical destiny of the West. This is our epoch. Yeah? So we have not yet gotten to, quote unquote, the Wesen of technology. Right?
What?
The essence.
The essence.
The essence of technology. We've not really opened this up to scrutiny yet. Yeah? Because we're dominated by this. This blinds us. This determines and blinds us completely. So the more internet, the more Facebook, all these things are blinding mechanisms, according to a Heidegger.
I hate to bring this up.
That's okay, Chris. I'm trying to set up something here. Yeah.
But Baudrillard's philosophy inspired the trilogy of The Matrix. They dedicate their movie to him.
I know.
And it's all about machines controlling human beings and
Yes.
taking the guise
Sure,
of
of
human
course.
beings. They look like humans.
Yeah, but Heidegger's saying this in the 30s and the 40s, not in the 80s.
Okay, but I'm just saying,
Way
I'm
before
just
Keanu
following
Reeves. Yeah,
the
yeah. No,
Norbert.
they know the Norbert Wiener. Yeah, I mean, you know, if you look at DARPA, you know, the all these projects that are going on. I don't know if you remember the magazine's Research, that used to come out, which was a kind of deconstruction of, Pentagon hyphen military industrial complex phenomena. This stuff is worth reading because it gives you the latest in terms of what's being experimented with. Crary's book, which is a little prescient, he wrote it probably 24/7, but anyway, one day, the whole thing of the white sparrow, why does the sparrow become, and especially the white sparrow, become such a bird? What are the code programs under the white sparrow? It's a bird they're studying who can stay up 7 days without sleep and still travel, right? Now, of course, they're going to try to apply this to soldiers, right? Trying to figure out what's the makeup, etc. $1 billion is being spent on. But then when you begin to take the terms such as sparrow, when you begin to think about this politically in terms of codes, what is sparrow code name for now that you have a movie, Red Sparrow, during the time of Russiagate, right? And all these other things happening at this point, right? And with the new final season of The Americans, which I recommend. I don't know if you've seen this TV series, but it's very good about infiltration.
Watched it two times and I couldn't go beyond that. I just thought it was so silly.
It was silly?
Yes.
The infiltration, and they were
I
scared
just
of
thought
Reagan?
nobody would believe it.
Oh, okay.
There's also the black swan.
based on that.
They
Actual
calculate
people.
how often it would take for a black swan to appear, given all the white
I hear
swans.
your white, your Wall Street background coming through.
No, the black swan is Bratton on the stack.
Yeah, I know he's on the stack, yeah. But Black Swan was also the name of the book, how many times will these Wall Street trading patterns,
okay.
about predictability as well. Yeah. I mean, listen, this whole question, here in terms of future and repetition, right? What we're really talking about here in some ways, and the factor of anxiety, and I wouldn't really try to make it mathematical, the anxiety, that's not the point. But somehow this has always already, right, in the tradition of calculative risk, right? Heidegger is well aware of this, that Descartes writes under the time of the age of probability. Probability theory emerges in the 17th century. Descartes' main goal is to establish the certainty of the ego, right? The certainty of knowledge, right? Against any kind of probability. Beyond a reasonable doubt. You see how, in some ways, even the legal system picks up on this in terms of the predictability and these kind of things. So it's very, 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 very interesting that, again, what he's fighting here is objectivity. Scientific objectivity, or this claim for scientific objectivity. He sees the crisis of European science as leading towards the age of cybernetics, in which there is no thinking. There's only just doing and determinism happening. There's only the production of information, right? Not really knowledge, right? Which Stigler takes up with, Arto, wish Arto was here, because we'd talk more about homo datum, but really the age of data, the age of the management of data, the age of, nobody discovers the restaurants anymore, just walking by them. Let's try this out. They check it out on the phone. How many stars? What happened here? Yeah, etc. It's all data-based. Everything's data-based, in a sense. So we no longer really even have knowledge. So there's no savoir, no knowledge, right, of making, right? We don't even have the knowledge to work with. We only have data. So the living itself is now being reduced to almost non-experiential levels, right? It's just, the food is for, the brain, right? It's not for the experience of the, the fullness of eating together, or, having a good, the quality of the meal, these kind of things. So I think, he's really on to something here. Yeah.
This is kind of an aside, but it's kind of interesting now. This has kind of been a common conversation recently in art and fashion too, is that all of these different platforms for research, essentially, like Pinterest, just the way you Google something, are all sort of arriving at the same information, right? So everyone's everyone's kind of original research is essentially the same.
It's
same
universalized.
Yeah.
It's sameness. There's
Right.
no
Yeah,
other
everything
anymore.
is the same.
Everything
So-
becomes this homogeneous same, right?
Yeah.
But what Nietzsche is talking about, this relationship, this dialectical tension is actually thrown out, right? It's only the will to power to one thing, which
Mhm.
is sameness,
Yeah.
right?
And
Completely
that's-
That's
remote.
certainty.
Yes, it is. It is kind of certainty in some ways, so certainly
If you have
scientific.
certainty,
Yeah.
it's going to be sameness.
Right, right, no, of course. Well, yes, I mean, there's nothing wrong with certainty about certain, about objects in the world. I mean, you don't want to be certain that, the water you drink is, not going to kill you. I mean, these kind of everyday moments are very, very important in science. This is not the question for Heidegger, right, in terms of measurement and, these kind of levels. The question is much more on where are we thrown in terms of the there, right? Where are we, oriented in all of this, and how much have we lost the possibility of experience? We don't experience anything anymore. Very, very little of this. Very little. We're all dominated by speed in so many ways. We're dominated by the acceleration of experience, of acceleration of life. Every time you go to the internet, believe me, your brain is operating at a much faster pace, right? In terms of what's clicking, so to speak, in this, and then it's scattered shot on the thing, right? You're not taking a step back for reflection where you're going to meditate for an hour, 2 hours a day about the silence of what it means to be philosophically there, right? This is no longer operative in the culture. No, nor was it really ever that much operative in the culture. However, now it's at the pace of where there is no self, there is no care, and there's no relationship to the world. These relationships have been, quote unquote, become datable and data-based together, right? Datable and data-based. Now they're talking about, this is what happens to you in retirement. They're trying to educate millennials about, that they're in their 20s and that they have to worry about retirement right now. I mean, you think about the ideology. Nothing against putting away money. That's not the issue. The issue is that this becomes part of the normative discourse that's out there. It's not about the quality of life you're going to live. It's about the quantity. It's always quantitatively, put out there. So yeah, I mean, it's really, in a sense, I think this is what Adorno and Heidegger have very much in common. They're both bemoaning, if you will, not nostalgically, but very bemoaning the lack of the ability for the human, if you will, or the Dasein, or for existence itself to really exist. Right?
And yet the internet can be a library. I have 500 PDFs on my iPad that I've gotten off the internet. I read it.
No, I understand
read
it as
stuff,
source.
yeah.
That's the logic of the supplement. Yeah, you don't need the books in the room anymore. You just need the supplement.
Well, you're
need the
still
what?
reading.
The question is, are you reading at the same level as you are with opening of a book? That's a real question to my mind. I know I'm conditioned out of reading, from many years ago and all of this. I know I'm a dinosaur in that sense. But to me, it's a much more active thing, turning pages of the book, smelling it, writing in the margins. And this is why I make hard copies. I will not read it on the screen. I
Well,
can
you
read
can,
it.
I was just going to say, you can print out the
But
articles.
Yes.
the problem, which is I think what you were trying to bring up before, is the sameness. You have to be careful because your iBook thing will then recommend some other book to you, and then somehow, without you even realizing, you get on this trace of control of the algorithm.
Yes.
If that's the dictatorship of the day right there.
But I don't take
You got a
it.
good
might not
essay
be,
there.
but everyone else
Dictatorship
is.
of the algorithm.
Yeah,
I like
that's
that.
what
But I don't.
It might, you might not, Chris, because you're smarter than a lot of people, but a lot of people are.
No, I mean, the temptation
Yeah.
is always there.
I mean, Amazon
You
gives
know?
me all sorts of pseudo-Marxist books all the time to recommend to me.
Right.
You know.
Pseudo is the
They
operative word.
recommend books I already have,
Yeah.
so.
Same, but you know, it is
Yes, I
dangerous.
mean, but see, there's a difference in terms of the intention. The intention is not to make you an agent of learning, you know, which is what learning's about. The intention is to sell. The intention is there for that. You can use it, you can use them to a certain degree. The problem again to me is that you get barraged, right? I mean, you know, and I'm the worst practitioner when I put up 20 books that we should be reading, you know. But anyway, I mean, we get barraged, the focus, right? The focus gets distorted, right? In such a way that we don't really engage, you know, in this kind of, you know, real conversation.
No.
Yeah.
I don't get books from Amazon, they charge me money for them. I get books, PDFs that are
No, I
free from
understand.
other people.
No, I understand. No, I know that I can figure out ways I never have to spend a cent on a book again.
But that's the best.
But I
case
still buy
scenario.
it.
Exactly. That's
That's like the best of the internet.
Yeah, that's the
yeah.
best.
Everything
but
else?
Most of the time,
I'll give you some sites where you can get
I'm not,
free
listen,
books.
I
listen.
know, I know.
Again, the
I-
question,
I-
I mean, we have Nori and I have a mutual friend who thinks 1992 changed everything with the advent of the internet. I'm not so sure about that, but anyway, all to say is that, look, it does, of course, you know, having this for scholars, where I can go and find out, you know, what's going on in Germany by going to certain sites without having to spend 3 hours in a library. I can do this in 5 minutes. It's great. I mean, this is great. This is a great tool to be used. The problem is that the public, right? Very few people know how to use those tools, you know? And secondly of all, very few people, if they're going to continually read and glance at this, I see the levels of the misunderstanding by these people in philosophical groups who are reading stuff just online and then doing all
Summary.
these comments.
Yeah.
It's summary,
Marx,
and in a lot of ways,
the
it's very false
invention,
summary.
Maoism,
Right.
Stalin.
Yeah,
And yeah. Well, she's going with the idea. You know, I got to think from an ex-girlfriend who wrote to me, "This may interest you. Tell me about Sidney Blumenthal's book on Lincoln," in which, you know, this whole thing of the book by Baptist came up because he cites some of the Baptist books. So this is why it was on my mind. I was looking at the Baptist book last night. So anyway, but I can see, and this is a very smart person, you know, this person writing me. She doesn't know that Sidney Blumenthal is a Democratic apparatchik, right? That he's basically, when he's going to write about slavery, is going to do so through a very jaded lens, that he's not going to see it, all of this is a systemic problem. So I have to tell her this. So she's going to post my stuff on her Facebook. All right. Yeah, you know, because I said.
And his son spends all his time rebelling against that.
Is he, what is he?
Max Blumenthal.
is that-
Oh, that's his son?
That's his son.
Oh, Max is great.
Yeah, Max is great.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I've met Max. Yeah, I know Max. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it's great for, you know, and especially when you have these small apartments in New York, I can hardly walk through mine in these days. You know, you're getting, you know, yeah, tables are filled, the kitchen's got, you know, everything. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I understand, you know, in terms of that economy and economy of scale and all these kind of things. But think about how these minds were formed, right? And the density of this thought versus what we're getting today, too. You know, that's another thing. Yeah, it's another thing. Yeah, you know, so there's something to be said for the old Gutenberg, you know, way of doing things.
Which
right?
was probably revolutionary and
Oh, you can
condemned by the
imagine
monks.
the
who were making-
theologians, the monks.
The monks who were
Well,
writing
you know
these
that
scrolls.
wonderful image on the front of the postcard, huh?
No,
Oh, you don't know this in the Derrida's book, the postcard from
No,
Freud
no,
to
I don't.
Socrates? It's Plato's dictating to Socrates to write it down, you know, behind, yeah. It's an inversion, you know. It's a beautiful piece by Derrida. The postcard from Socrates to
and
Freud.
Plato is dictating to
Yeah, there's
Socrates.
a monk, yeah, kind of like over his shoulder, sitting there like this. Right? Socrates, he who does not write. Right? You remember that? That's the inscription of Methodology. And then he calls upon the god of cuneiform forms. The beginning, the arche writing, right? You know, instead of having the arche, you know, here the principles, right? In Heidegger, the arche writing, Derrida takes the arche, right? You know, commandment, obedience, and principle, and turns this into commandment, obedience, and principle of writing. This is what's really being investigated there.
And that's what we're talking about.
We are talking about that, yeah. And we're talking about, can electronic writing, can this age of the cybernetic really get to that, that kind of level of density? What happens to texture? What happens to feeling? You know, these are questions I ask myself. You know, I love the smell of books for some reason, I don't know. That's why I got allergies, but anyway, I'm just.
Well, I still think that the monastery would say, you smell the ink on this scroll I'm writing, and you can see my thumbprint.
Well, I wish I could write on scrolls. I wouldn't mind that, you know, turning the pages. And is there really that much to say? That's another question we have to ask. Yeah. Is there really that much to say in the age? You know, I mean, methodologically, we're probably in possession of everything that we could ever possibly need. Methodologically, I'm saying, yeah. Then the question is, what can really be said within those methods, right? To me, there are four important methods going forward, right? There's the genealogical that we inherit from Nietzsche, certainly the Marxian dialectical in terms of an open dialectic, and I'm talking about from Lukács to the Frankfurt School to Althusser. There are many variants on that in a certain way. There's the hermeneutical through Heidegger, right? Phenomenological, you know, through Husserl, you know, getting back to the things themselves. These are the methods. And then, of course, positivism has benefits at times. You know, we do want to know what our temperature's reading if we're on fire, you know, at a certain time. You know, it does have some quality. So let's say 5 basic methods, you know, that we employ, you know, and can do so with productivity.
Just
Yeah,
reflecting
sure.
back on where
Sorry.
I'm at, like in terms of like institutions like in universities. I think genealogical method is very respected because many of my colleagues read Foucault, but I don't really know what the real genealogy is, but what they are talking about is more of the mapping as opposed to genealogy.
Yeah, right. No,
And just
genealogy.
seeing, like, kind of
Yeah.
sameness is,
Yeah. The
So-
genealogical method in Foucault is also alongside the archaeological, which
Yeah.
also looks at principles. And Nietzsche, when he advances the genealogical, is mostly through language. It's not just mapping.
Yeah.
It's a linguistic set of color. You know, this is an experiment in linguistics. You know, going for material etymology, which Heidegger is also excellent at. These are the two of the best in terms of material etymology. Marx does it, but Marx never points attention to it. You know, Marx is very careful with his language, especially, you know, in the early days all the way up. You know, he'll put the German word, you know, or he'll repeat it at multiple levels. So yes, this kind of again, attunement to language, to structure, to the difference between the language system in the Saussurean sense, the language implode, the utterance, all of these things are very, very important going on. And you're right, this becomes a question of reading maps, which can be interesting
Yes.
material, but it's a cartography, and Deleuze is considered to be part of a new cartography more than a Foucault, yeah, in some ways. So I hear what you're saying. I mean, you can see where that would work in architecture and in certain other fields where you do use, you know, these kind of tools. Yeah. How they would apply Foucault or others. I mean, this is what I like about Stickler. It's not really just mapping. You know, there's thinking going on throughout. I mean, I like that very much with him. I like it also with Badiou, you know, in terms of the quote, more bigger names of today, you know, so to speak. Yeah. I mean, the more I read of Stiegler, the more impressed I am, even though the writing is terrible. it's going through thickets, to really get, I mean, you can reduce it, but in some ways, sometimes a thing. But I like the three myths, though. We have the Promethean, which is what both Heidegger and Marcuse are critiquing. Marcuse and Eros and Civilization, the Faustian bargain, the Faustian age that comes out of the Promethean, and certainly the Epimethesis is that, we are really, have to think this in terms of the technics has made us. We're not making we're not manufacturers. We've been quote unquote manufactured in some ways.
The genealogy also has this kind of repetition to it, right? Also bringing back the past, bringing back the models to the current, not just mapping them, right?
Yeah, it's not only just mapping, he's also developing concepts.
Right.
He's not just mapping something, he's developing a new production of new concepts. He's talking about bad conscience and good conscience. How this happens, right? He's talking about guilt from the language, what is obligated, what a debt is, etc. This is also going on in conscience with Heidegger. Heidegger is repeating in this section we'll read for next week on conscience and all of this, the Nietzschean moment, right? In some ways, the call of consciousness. What is the call of the debt? Where is the level of the obligation that we have? And this is all part, again, of our responsibility of, say, being abandoned to freedom or being towards death without fleeing, right? Without flight, right? These most people flight. They're in flight. This is what consumerism's built on. Not just to consume, we need to consume, but consumerism is built on being in flight. When I'm depressed, I go shopping. You know how many times I've heard that? When I'm depressed, I go shopping. It makes me feel better. So you keep the society depressed. Keep them all so alive. Right? Please.
To Nori's point, though,
Yeah.
I mean, this mapping thing doesn't make sense to me either. Just because isn't genealogy doing a genealogy more about looking for this, like the moments, like the more important. It's more hermeneutical in a way. It's like looking at the moments of the important moments, where there's a stress placed.
Stress is a very good word to use, because this is what Nietzsche and what Foucault both say. If you want to confront your colleagues on it, I'm just throwing the it's okay. But I mean, it's really a question. No, Rachel put her finger on it. It's really about the stress in the language. What is being stressed? And Foucault actually uses the German when he writes the essay on Nietzsche, genealogy, and history. Right? Yeah. Foucault's an interesting character. Foucault and Derrida and Stigler are three interesting characters with the whole Nietzsche-Heidegger moment. In my opinion, Foucault's dismantling of the disciplines in archaeology of knowledge, the whole positioning of episteme, discursive regularities, is deeply indebted to Heidegger, right? In a lot of ways, right? As is words and things, the order of things, right? This is very, very deeply indebted to Heidegger, and in some ways, Foucault shows at times excellent positivism in this work. We'd have to read it to show it, but I'm just throwing out, a possible, a code for reading, those works. Then he becomes, much more Nietzschean later on, when he writes Nietzsche, genealogy, history. He begins to look at this in terms of the ways history can be done. He takes on the antiquarian, the monumental, and this is for Foucault an advance on reading archives. That I can take out the case of Pierre Revere, having murdered my brother, my sister, my mother, and my father, right? And I can read this in the context of the hidden letters, the letters of Cachet, right?
The French Revolution.
In the French Revolution, and think about this in that kind of context by undoing, the principles at that time, not mapping anything, but looking at the stress, right, in the writing that produced this kind of character, right, in a way, a different kind of, and another kind of, and it's an example of reading the archive. This is what he's really trying to do. Yes, the Zeitgeist. Well, but reading the archive, but not constructing reading the language not only contextually, but reading the language as part of the system, as part of the discursive regularity, right? Now, again, Derrida writes archive fever. You don't remember? Okay. He writes that archive theory, fever, which is, kind of looks at Foucault again, and Condillac, and how the archive has been read through the years. So you go into an archive, what are you going to find? Look, a guy like Edward Baptist, I'm going to try to get him to come to the Left Forum. I think it'd be great to hear someone like this. This is a first-rate mind, historical mind at work. Anyway, a guy like him is going to go to the archives. He's able to put together, he's not only mapping something, he's making connections, right, between concepts, documents, all these things. He's reading and unfolding the parchment in a very different way. He's just not mapping it out. This happened here in the Mississippi River, and this happened here in Lake Erie, right? And this happened in, the fur trade and the Hudson, right, etc. He's not looking, this went on with J.P. Stevens and the Carolinas. He's not mapping. He's doing archival work, which is undoing through the documents, right, what the story really was, what it really was. It is a will to truth, if you will, a will to truth, in some ways. So this is what, the Foucault, attempt, to my knowledge. Foucault's will to power is the will to knowledge. The will to power in Heidegger is the will to art, to making art. Yeah. Foucault's much more of an epistemologist, thinking through questions of epistemology. Heidegger's thinking both aesthetic questions and, of course, very deep. And again, I doubt they could be in the same room with each other. But anyway, that's another story. So this whole thing about mapping and genealogy is different. That's also the thing with dialectics. I mean, most of these people probably in the Me Too movement are going to say, oh, we're Marxists, or we're leftists, right? Some of them will say this. There's no dialectical thinking going on. How can they say they're leftists? They don't really look at the other side of this at all. Are they really dealing with systemic power relations? Not at all. They're dealing with images. They're dealing with images and what they think is right, judgment only, in my book. I'm not condoning, I can't stand people like Harvey Weinstein or this kind of stuff. But on another level, no one is really bringing up that this is basically, a practice in Hollywood since Hollywood was invented. Yeah.
It still doesn't mean it's not power related.
I didn't say that. I said they're not talking about that,
The exercise of power.
Of course. But dialectically, you have to think about that exercise of power all the time. It has to be in a dialectical way, right? It can't just be that person had power over me. Right? That's very one-sided.
It bothers me that we hear about the people in Hollywood when we're not hearing about the immigrants working the fields.
I agree.
Which probably has much
You can
greater
imagine.
frequency
You can imagine.
of power
And
relations.
you say you don't have slave-backed mortgage securities, but I bet you they do have bundles like this.
Sure.
Yeah. And you think about
Bristol
it.
Bears.
Yeah. What's human trafficking? What kind of stuff is that? The entire pornography industry in a certain way. How that becomes capital. You're talking $15 billion a year just for the pornography industry. And that's just on the surface. That doesn't talk about the informal economy around that.
There's a whole rescue industry about human trafficking where they rescue women from sex work who may not want to be rescued.
Yeah, okay, well, that's the paradoxical nature, yes, I understand, yeah. No, I'm not, yeah.
I mean, people come and live on image.
It's true.
It's. I was having an argument with a friend, an old acquaintance, and about the Russia stuff, and,
Right.
She watches it on MSNBC.
Oh God.
And, She saw the same person on MSNBC as I was sending her, you know, a clip of from somewhere else. This woman, Marsha Gessen, who's a Russian, who says it's crazy, you know. And
Yeah, she was on
but she watched her on MSNBC and she said, yeah, she said Russia was the biggest threat that was going on, and I have a serious problem believing that, you know. But because of the image of the
Right, I mean, this raises a question of, again, authority, repetition, etc., and how media, we don't have enough critical media studies, and again, I've said this before, and I don't think I'm alone in this by any means, but, you know, Chomsky failed the left in that he had the wherewithal and he had the institutional presence to be able to study how authoritarianism works in the media through linguistic codes. You know, what are the codes that are being pronounced daily, etc. They started outstanding, he and Herman, in manufacturing consent.
Yeah.
And then Ed Herman continued with Beyond Hypocrisy. Herman, in my
Yeah,
Herman was the real deal till the end, till he
Yeah.
died about a couple of months ago, you know, in Philadelphia. But anyway, the problem with Chomsky is he never really studied. He had the wherewithal to look at the grammatical codes, right? He can use his own models to show it at work with regenerative, you know, grammar, you know, and, you know, maybe even open it up, and you could have had debates, right, of how does one go about this, but he never entered the fray. It was always about Israel did this, you know, this is awful, and you know, whatever. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, you know. The Nicaragua lectures, as you know, on, you know, hegemony and, yeah.
Christian Metz wrote quite a
I
bit
like
about
Christian Metz.
analyzing media, its codification. and
Yes, but
language.
it's not continuing today. See, part of the
No.
problem is there's been major changes that go on.
Yeah.
The language now, you know, has been so changed since 1979. You began to realize this in the New York Times, where all of a sudden freedom fighters were revolutionaries, when the freedom fighters were really total reactionaries. We know this. Now freedom fighter means something positive. You know, I mean, how do these codes change? This is the question, you know, I think could be worth asking, you know, in terms of materialism of the image, materialism of the linguistic codes. You know, how does this really play out? Very important.
This Black Panther garbage.
Yeah, then the Black Panther comes out of this, right? They're going to have
Yeah.
nothing but
Yeah.
slogans and kind of things that are going to be repeated on the streets. A whole generation of youth will be educated on this, and they're not going to have any relationship to why was Huey Newton targeted? Why, especially why was Fred Hampton killed? And what was Fred Hampton reading? What were the books in Fred Hampton's apartment that made him dangerous? Why was he called the Black Messiah? You know, these are kind of interesting moments. Would Fred Hampton, if alive today, be able to go into Appalachia or go into you know, certain rural parts of Pennsylvania, or even out to the you know, Arizona, Utah, these places, and talk to people in a realistic way? This was a, you know, a talent he had, you know, and an ability to be accepted, and also to treat them like human beings. It wasn't just, I'm black, you're white, you know, kind of mentality. He understood this. He understood systemics. But again, we don't have characters like that. We have Glenn Ford, we have Dixon, you know, we have these people from Black Agenda Report, a few other people out there that are giving the critical stuff, you know. Yeah, I mean, you know, Adolph Reed when he gets going to write, and August Nimps, and, you know, we have a few people, you know, Kevin Alexander, Davis is still doing stuff. What, I'm sorry?
Yeah, I just saw people, of course, Campbell.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
hadn't heard for a long time.
Yeah.
Talking about, I think South Africa was it? And-
Yeah, good,
Yeah.
good.
Very,
No.
very sharp.
Yeah, no, sharp, but the problem is it's not part of the daily discourse anymore. It's not part of an academic exercise in a way, because despite the fact that the schools are completely defunct in my view, and have completely failed, the institutions, there's still the place where you have 15 million people attending. And there's supposedly books on the table and writings, etc. This is not being done in the universities. It is not being done in the institution. What?
It's Marx at the university.
Yes, it's Marx. Yeah, yeah,
According
yeah.
to
Yeah, I'm very ashamed. I have to write the NRA lecture. You forgot to mention my name. I teach Marx. Here's my syllabus. Read my, yeah.
Are all Marxists.
Yeah.
It's really the lack of having been there-ness is happening, no?
Yeah.
If I put it into Heidegger's term.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are we saying yes to?
It's a very lack of having been there-ness. I'm saying this trying to really understand this term as well.
Yes.
Am I using it right though?
Well, it's okay. Yeah. I mean, you can use it that way. I mean, you're using it metaphorically to try to understand something. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I don't think I mean, look, again, when you read philosophy or you read something like this, you're going to try to, you're always in a process of interpreting, right? We all bring, some kind of processes of interpreting to a text, right? Always, right? So to get to the pure meaning is a futile exercise. This is contaminated, tremendously. Another great insight of Derrida, that the pharmacon is both purification and contamination simultaneously. And unless you look at the contamination, right, you're not really going to get anywhere. Yeah? So not corruption, but contamination. Where are the terms contaminated? And he understands it. I mean, this is a great thing. I mean, I'm talking somewhat to Chris here, but all of us. The difference, right, which is not a concept. It is a system in which, right, we look at those contaminations, right, that set up how that concept was invented, what was it privileging at that moment, etc. And this is the politics, if you will, of difference, right? Not the politics of just that we're different, right? This is the linguistic politics or the capital politics of, words, images, and texts, right? The politics really of the text. It's very, very important because, we live in a world of texts. Right? When I say texture, it's coming out of text as well. This is the cotton business, the tree
I
business.
have to ask why this film is so popular.
Which one?
It's Black Panther. It's breaking all the records, and as you said, there'll be a Black Panther 2 and 3 and 4. Why is it so popular?
I think because of who's funding it. I really think when you put money behind something that much, then the idiots are just take it up. They don't have a choice. They're literally addicted to their phones and the garbage that comes out of it. I'm sure there was so much money put into it. People were buying tickets a month in advance.
Think about the
no
genealogy.
Choice.
2 years ago at the Super Bowl, Beyonce pays lip service with some stupid thing.
I mean,
think about Black Lives Matter being out there and how people talk about this. Talk about, the basically the brutality in certain neighborhoods, the Trumpism that is now bringing back the white supremacy, right, et cetera. All these things are feeding into this in terms of relations that produce this need. And as Rachel says, there's this tremendous amount of money, publicity money, and it's huge, the budget. 200 million went into this.
There's a need for the myth.
Can you imagine the 200 million going into schools?
I'm not your Negro, for example.
Or I'm not your Negro schools.
There's a need for this
I like that
myth,
title
though,
for the schools. I'm not your Negro.
Because of white supremacy,
Right.
because of Trump,
Yeah.
there's a need for a myth. That
Well, yeah,
Black
that's
Panther
a good
provides.
reading. Yeah, in a lot of ways. You're going to add that to your paper, right?
But it's also,
Right.
it's also the image. It's
Right.
the domination
Yeah.
of the image.
Yeah.
As
Yes,
well.
of course. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
No, listen, the mastery is from the cave. Who controls the camera from the cave forward? We're looking at this. Who controls, again, in Marxist terms, who's controlling the means of production, but also who's controlling the image? How is the image controlled and remade, etc.? I've done clippings. I'm teaching Snowpiercer next week, and then I'm going to do Vias for Vendetta. So I've collected all these images from the New York Times of Trump who looks just like John Hurt in V for Vendetta, right? Right? I have this going on, you know. And then I have other images of the Davos, right? I have the images of the National Security Agency, all sitting around in a dark room if we do Dr. Strangelove. You know, so I have all this kind of lined up because I know that this is the way into the psyche, but then from there, how do you get to the next level of these are physical objects, like we're talking about the making of the Black Panther. How is this funded? What is the physicality, all these levels of production? Much less than the turning, going back to the allegory of the cave, the turning into the objective, you know, of it, its intention. What is it going to do in terms of neutralization, right? How is this going to feed the NBA, the NFL, you know, all the, you know, dominant sports, right, in another way? And ultimately, what does this say about our culture in terms of, you know, one thing from the myth, right? But the myth must become, you know, a praxis, right? In order for it to have effect. And this myth will not give us a positive political practice, this movie, this image, right? It will not. It is not. It is not Mingus, done by Matthew Reichman in 1968 at NYU. It's not, you know, a story of the books in Fred Hampton's apartment made, these documentaries that were made. It's not even close. It's not even Shaft, which has some radicality, because Shaft, even as a blaxploitation film, actually talked about, and you know, Sweet Bad, you know, remember the controversy around Sweet Badasses, Mario Van Peebles, yeah. Anyway, it's not even Shaft, in that, you know, Shaft at least had to rely upon the Panthers in order to get, you know, Bumpy Johnson's daughter back from the, you know, he had to meet with the mob too. These kind of connections are at least being drawn, right, during the period. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also rich territory for genealogy of this. I mean, I was surprised to hear that the term Black Panther came out at the same time as the Marvel character in the Black Panther movement, and it's a question. I don't know. Maybe some other people know.
What do you mean Marvel character in the Black Panther movement?
Well, the first
What
Black
movie?
Panther goes way back, you know, among the Marvel. You know, he was a Marvel character.
Yeah.
Before the Black Panther.
They claim, but it's
No,
concurrent.
they
It's
concurrent. They
It's
say a month
concurrent.
before.
Yeah, you can't.
They cook this one.
Concurrent.
Yeah,
This is called cooking the books. Cooking the
Yeah.
books, David.
It's definitely
Don't be
different.
duped, David. You know, we're non-dupes here. That's this class.
No, but I think
It's your temporality now.
Yeah, right.
It's an interesting question in terms of
Right.
myth making and
Right.
how Marvel and Hollywood versus
Sure.
reality. I mean, okay, it's a great image, but
Right.
still, but then there's also, I mean, I haven't seen the movie, but I've read I made up.
Yeah, I'll probably go see the film
Yeah.
just to see the levels of the reception. You're not going, you
I
can't
told
do
people
it.
how to
Okay.
do it because of my
Go
class.
ahead.
We'll go together. Rachel works late. Rachel, you had a 4-day week, I hope, this week.
I had a 3-day.
I'm now getting it.
3-day week.
Yeah, but anyway, I think there's a lot, for example, of Plato in it too. I mean,
Right.
the politics, it's not at all a democracy, nothing close to it. It's a monarchy with trial by combat and, bloodlines and,
Well, Plato was for the aristocracy. not
yeah,
a
well, this
monarch.
is too. It's only,
Yeah.
the battles for leadership only take place among the royal bloodlines, from what I
Right,
understand, nowhere else. And then it's a sort of Shakespearean, Oedipal,
Yeah, but look again, as we all know in this room, I mean, the Black Panthers really were the outgrowth of policing the police.
Yeah.
Sure.
It was not about a comic hero or something like that. It was actually born in reality in
No,
certain
it wasn't-
neighborhoods,
it wasn't saying
and it was
that.
about that the police are brutalizing our neighborhoods. This is too much social control, and we learn to police the police. It was also about education of why that happens, right? And what are our rights within that policing of the police, right? And when Huey Newton's reputation is made, you want to do a black superhero, show Huey Newton reciting to the police, you're 3 feet closer to me than you should be by city ordinance XXXX, right? Show this intelligence at work, knowing the civic codes and the laws, and build from there in a way. And you can do a comics like a March for Beginners, a Black Panthers for Beginners, which would have been really educational, which in some ways you don't really lose money. Again, this is another capitalist fallacy. You can sell those kind of books, introductory books, to the high schools and start educating a group of people. Of course it's too frightening. Get too much anxiety.
This is precisely why they make this sort of movie now,
Right.
like after the Black
Right.
Lives Matter,
Absolutely.
which as we know is also, certainly not the Black Panther movement.
Right.
And maybe to your point, Chris, maybe it is the need for a myth because they had the myth of Obama before, and so it just keeps getting watered down. Next we'll end up with Oprah.
Already got her, Rachel. Very good, though. I see this essay developing. The black papers. You're going to be the head of the black papers. I got the red papers. Right. But good point. Yeah. Have you seen it? Did you see it? No, you didn't see the film.
No, I'm not allowed to because of what we've talked about sometimes.
Oh, you're not allowed.
I
Okay.
had a group of friends who went, I said I didn't see it.
Sometimes good to have people in the czar's bedroom, or in the Hollywood production studio. Yeah, no, you can see the amount of attention to this. Listen, I scan, maybe I take about 20 minutes a day, sometimes more, to scan the dominant media. And they have these people on the dominant media talking about the film, how great it is, what positive role models for our youth. I'm telling you, it's nauseating. I can see why she doesn't want to go see the movie. I'm beyond nausea,
Didn't they have TV shows where they're trying to get the kids out of school so they can go see the movie?
Yes.
Oh my God.
No, I have no interest in seeing it.
Yes.
But it's all about making money, isn't it?
Well, of course it's about making money, but the making money has the ideological import. See, we're interested. We know we can do the numbers. We can look at the red or the black on this. But anyway, the question is really what ideological effects does it have on institutions, on the streets, for building a positive movement? These are the real questions. It's about movement.
It's not going to build any positive.
No, I know that, but what effects do we have to confront? What is it about? If we're friends, you can be friends of the forms, as Aristotle used that, but we're greater friends to the truth. That was his remark about Plato. In the Nicomachean Ethics, there are friends to the forms. You can say there are many friends to the, whatever's produced out there in terms of the images, but we're greater friends to the truth. So, that's the question. Where does the critique begin? How's it relentless?
I haven't really been paying that much attention to when they say you should go to see it so positive. What do they mean by being positive?
Because it's made by a black director with an all-black cast.
That's one element.
It's just identity.
It's also positive. It's also positive in terms of the identity, and Rachel can confirm this. You're talking about probably $150 to $300 million in fashion products.
So they can make
after this.
Then
you're also looking at a new franchise, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Anyway,
So you're going to see the costumes
we can
around.
contain the nausea to go back to Heidegger.
Yeah.
I feel bad.
I'm going to go back to
I'm
wholeness.
just angry today.
Yeah.
I'll hold it in.
Wait till dinner.
Wait till dinner. All right. Turn to page 240. I want to just point out some of the most important passages of here. Right. This is a very, very beautiful passage. If you look at the third paragraph,
Where is this?
this is on page 240, section 50. Let's go to the second paragraph. Right. First, we must make clear. Here goes Heidegger, right? In the preliminary way, how the existence, the facticity, and falling prey of design reveal themselves in the phenomena of death. The interpretation of the not yet, the future, and thus also of the most extreme not yet, of the end of design in the sense of something outstanding, was rejected as inappropriate, for it included the ontological distortion of design as something objectively present. Being at an end means existentially being toward the end. And the toward is important here as a preposition, very, very important. The most extreme not yet has the character of something to which Dasein relates itself. The end is imminent for Dasein. Death is something not yet objectively present, nor the last outstanding element reduced to a minimum, but rather an imminence, a Bewusstsein. However, many things can be imminent for Dasein as being in the world. The character of imminence is not in itself distinctive for death. On the contrary, the interpretation could make us suspect that death would have to be understood in the sense of an imminent event to be encountered in the surrounding world. For example, a thunderstorm can be imminent, remodeling a house, the arrival of a friend, according beings which are objectively present at hand or designed with. Imminent death does not have this kind of being, but a journey, for example, can also be imminent for Dasein, or a discussion with others, or renouncing something which Dasein can be, its own possibilities of being, which are founding in being with others. Death is a possibility of being that Dasein always has to take upon itself. Okay? Not in, but upon itself. Very, very crucial. With death, Dasein stands before itself in its own most thing proper to you, your eigen mit, most appropriate, if you will, or most proper to you is better put, potentiality of being. In this possibility, Dasein is concerned about its being in the world absolutely. And this is important, being in the world absolutely, seems to sharpen everything. Its death is the possibility of no longer being able to be there. When Dasein is immanent to itself as this possibility is completely thrown back upon its own most potentiality of being. Thus, immanent to itself, all relations to other Dasein are dissolved in it. This non-relational, and this is important, non-relational almost possibility as at the same time the most extreme one. As a potentiality of being, Dasein is unable to bypass the possibility of death. Death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Thus, death reveals itself as one's own most non-relational and insuperable possibility. As such, it is an eminent imminence, right? As Henry James said about death, at last the distinguished thing.
Last what?
At last the distinguished thing. That's what he said when he died. Christ said it is finished. Goethe said more light. I like Goethe's the best of the three, but anyway. Yeah, more light. Its existential possibility is grounded in the fact that Dasein is essentially disclosed to itself, and it is disclosed as, and this is interesting, you're always being ahead of itself, right? Once again, the futural, being ahead of, right? The structural factor of care has the most primordial concretion in being towards death. Being towards the end becomes phenomenally clear as being towards the eminent possibility of Dasein which we have characterized. Right? The own most non-relational, page 241, Chris, if you're, is not created by Dasein subsequently and occasionally in the course of being. Rather, when Dasein exists, it is already thrown into this possibility. Initially, and for the most part, Dasein does not have any explicit or theoretical, and this is interesting, death is not theoretical knowledge, right? It's very important to remember, of the fact that it is delivered over to its death, and that death thus belongs to being in the world. Thrownness into the death reveals itself more primordially and more penetrating in the attunement of anxiety. Very important, the attunement of anxiety. Anxiety in the face of death is anxiety in the face of the almost non-relational and insuperable potentiality of being. What anxiety is about is being in the world itself. Actually, to be in a world, right? In a sense. And in some ways, this Weltlos, this worldlessness, in some ways, is a product of the internet, too. We could talk about it this way. And in a lot of ways, that you have a worldlessness, a Weltlos, loss of worldness. Therefore, there is no anxiety of being. Thank you, David. Okay. We'll see you.
I owe you.
That's all right. Okay. We'll see you next week. And I hope it's the other room, but we'll be here if not. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Okay. All right. So think about this too, vis-a-vis what we've talked about today as almost an empirical facticity, right? What anxiety is about is being in the world itself. What anxiety is about is simply the potentiality of being, of Dasein. Anxiety about death must not be confused with a fear of one's downfall or demise. It is not an arbitrary and chance weak mood of an individual. I wish I were dead. You know the phrases, right? Yeah. But as a fundamental attunement of Dasein, fundamental, a ground attunement, and I like the way, maybe a better translation, Grundbefindlichkeit is really the ground also, fundamental is good, but really the ground problem, a basic attunement, right, if you will. It is the disclosiveness of the fact that Dasein exists as thrown, being towards its end, right? Being towards its end. Thus, the existential concept of dying is clarified as thrown being towards the your own most proper to you, what you really own is this. You're non-relational, it's non-relational, and insuperable potentiality of being. Okay? Yeah. As Bob Dylan says in one of the songs, well, what's mine? And then the guy responds, well, what is? Right? He's speaking about this kind of, all that really belongs to you for Heidegger is death. This is your own most possibility. That is which is most proper to you. Right? This is why death is a master from Germany at one level. Celan's also talking about occupation, right? French-Romanian poet, but yeah, it's interesting. So I think precision is gained by distinguishing this from mere disappearance. When you say someone passed, it's usually they disappeared, right? Right? And instead is gained distinguishing this, and also from merely perishing, and finally from the experience of a demise. Okay? So he's trying to really elaborate what he means here, being towards death, right? As your own most possibility. And again, in terms of the therapeutic, right? The fundamental structures, in my opinion, before you look at neurosis, is the fundamental structures are really the existential structures, right? That you have to deal with in any kind of therapeutic situation. It's very important. Whoops. Sean, your Mont Blanc fell to its death. Fell off the mountain, the white mountain there in Switzerland. Okay. So anyway, all right. So being towards the end does not first arise through some attitude which occasionally turns up. Oh, I'm going to die one day, right? Or things like that. Rather, it belongs essentially to the mood, the thrownness of Dasein, which reveals itself, again, in attunement in various ways. The factical knowledge or lack of knowledge prevalent in Dasein as to its own most being towards the end is only the expression of the existential possibility of maintaining itself in this being in different ways. That factually many people initially and for the most part do not know about death must not be used to prove that being towards death does not universally belong to Dasein. Rather, it only proves that Dasein, fleeing for itself, initially and for the most part, covers up, right? Covers over its own most being towards death. Dasein dies factically as long as it exists, but initially and for the most part in the mode of falling prey. Okay? this addictive, moment. For factically existing is not only generally and without further differentiation a thrown potentiality being in the world, but it is always already absorbed in the world, taken care of. And this absorption is also interesting vis-a-vis our conversations about internet and cybernetics. Being absorbed into something, fleeing and being absorbed together as a, kind of a psychic state, right? Yeah. In this entangled, it goes back to the entanglement, being together with, the flight from uncanniness makes itself known. That is, the flight from its own most being towards death. Existence, facticity, falling prey, characterize being towards the end, and are accordingly constitutive for the existential concept of death. With regards to its ontological possibility, dying is grounded in care. Yep, very, very important. Dying is grounded in care. But if being towards death belongs primordially and essentially to the being of design, it must also be demonstrated in everydayness, although initially in the inauthentic. So we begin with a description of the inauthentic. Nobody's ever fully authentic, even for Heidegger. You're never fully authentically living, in a sense. There may be degrees that you're moving towards this authentic encounter, but you're not always living fully authentic. And the description begins at the level of inauthenticity. You don't begin at the levels of authenticity. Yeah? Do you have a question or thought?
I have a question.
I was just thinking that
Yes.
he's talking about being towards death as being towards one's own death. He doesn't seem to mention the anxiety of other people dying. It's family members.
Well, he doesn't, no. I mean, this has been a criticism of he doesn't flesh out what they call he'll mention it at times, but it's never really fleshed out. The mid-side, right?
Being retarded.
Yeah, being with others. Yeah, the middle, the being with, right?
And isn't that an anxiety?
I'm sorry?
Couldn't that be an anxiety?
Of course that could be an anxiety, but it's not your own most possibility.
I see.
It doesn't.
He's looking at the subject and the subjectivity, not the question of empathy or feeling the other. When you say, I feel you, to Heidegger, that's secondary.
So you can I don't know, you can achieve your own most possibility by being as much as possible attuned to your being towards death, right?
Yes, I mean, what your attunement and what your encounter, let's put it that way, with your mortality and your being towards death and all these moments does, according to Heidegger, is it begins to give you a sense of your non-relational way of being in death, right, on the one hand, and then being able to see a totality or a wholeness of being as a possibility. And that's when you begin to live whole, or you live fully in another kind of sense. Now, what Chris raises is really a question of the other, and Heidegger really doesn't deal.
To me, that's more anxiety producing than one's own death.
Not for Heidegger.
For me,
Maybe.
Heidegger sat there.
Maybe. So Heidegger would say to you, Chris, that you're probably fleeing for
Yeah,
your own
exactly.
most possibility.
So
He would say that to
your
you,
anxiety is
and you would have a deeper feeling of that loss if you were encountering your own most possibility in the totality of your relations. Because you can't have those relations unless you know the non-relational space, right, in which, you've encountered your own being towards death as a possibility.
I disagree.
You can disagree with
I
that.
think
It's okay. He's not here. He's not here. No problem.
He's not here.
No problem. He's not here.
maybe
He's there, but he's not here.
Maybe I'm Hegelian, but the fear
You're
of
what?
death. Maybe I'm just being Hegelian.
Well, what do you mean Hegelian in
The
this sense? I
master
mean,
slave.
Yeah.
The fear of death, of my own death, is not as frightening as the fear of
But why wouldn't you kill the master
Other
if you don't
people-
fear? Why wouldn't
other
you fight the
people-
master to the death? if
I
you
would
don't
do
fear the
that
death.
as long as my
But
nearest
that's
and
your
dearest
possibility.
weren't
That's
present.
not your possibility for others.
If the master said to me, I'll kill your next of kin, then I'd be scared. Not if he kills me.
But again, look, it's the thrownness of the encounter. So say you're Frederick Douglass, right? That encounter is not about, Frederick Douglass only thinking about his aunt and, these kind of moments earlier on, but it's about his own most possibility, right, of possibly dying at the hands, right, of the whip, and what he's going to do, against coffee, against the master, and he's willing to risk his life to engage this. Now, you can ask the question by risking one's life, like a Toussaint, a Che, many of the revolutionary heroes, etc. We can go down the list, right, of these people, and many unforgotten, many X's in the history of, of a revolutionary struggle, that they took on their own most possibility, for the other, etc. It's a story, but it's still their own most possibility in the moment, right? That's the thing. That Che is well aware that he could be gunned down in Latin America, just like, yeah. So this is something that's real. It's not really only about empathy, sympathy, the anxiety of loss, right? This is about the anxiety of what's your possibility, not the loss of someone. I think there's a difference here, yeah? If you can kind of see this. I mean, you're more than welcome to argue with Heidegger. I mean, that's not a problem to me, or I doubt to Heidegger either, But the question is, once again, is that a question of flight? I don't know what I'm going to do without so-and-so. Is that for Heidegger a question that you're shirking, right, in a certain way, or you're fleeing your own most possibility of living by saying that? I can't live without them, etc. I mean, I think my mother probably would have lived a few, but she told someone, I'm very lonely without my, her husband. So she lasted 5-6 years after that. Some people last a longer time. And in a way, they may be, confronting their own most possibility. This is something to be, thought about. I'm not
Well,
saying
she might
it's
have had a different feeling about if she lost you.
That's true, yeah. Well, I'm going through that with an aunt right now, who lost her son. Yeah. That's what I did this morning. I had to figure out some things to do on that front. Who still lives through it every time it's a huge loss to her. But at the same time, her possibility is still living, and she, and her husband used to say, life is for the living. Right? In a certain way, and almost possibility, right? Yeah, what were we going to say?
Like Lumumba could have escaped.
Yes.
But he went back for his wife and child.
Yes. Jose Dolores could have escaped with Marlon Brando and burned. There's a lesson there. There's a real lesson. Went to the guillotine, went to the hanging, right? The real lessons are really about these kind of people, in some ways. So what does the own most possibility really mean here? So I think what you're dealing with is something else that is right. I mean, I'm not saying Heidegger's right about this, but in a way he's really trying to deal with the subjectivity and the possibility. Now again, that the possibility is higher than the actuality. This is not a discourse, if you will, or at the level of subjectivity. It's not about subjectivity and the other. It's about subjectivity, right? It's not about subjectivity and the other so much, right? So, he's talking about Dasein, the there-ness of the being, the there-ness that each one of us in the room has in terms of our own potentiality and our own most possibility. And through that encounter with our own most possibility, that we are freed, if you will, towards project, towards, possibility, etc. For Sartre, we choose a project in that moment in terms of our encounter with nothingness. We choose our project. Yeah. So what's, yeah.
My question
Yeah.
was not so crazy. Mine was more about.
Excuse me,
No, I just meant like so complicated.
Inauthentic.
That's true.
I think you should start all over.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. I meant.
You gotta learn how to do a Hegelian preface better. You have to learn a Hegelian preface better.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, one.
Mine was more about just to defining some words.
Oh, okay.
My question was how this word imminence is defined. I guess the way I define it is forthcoming, impending. And I wanted to know if that was really right or if we're really talking about imminence in more of the theological sense.
No, I think he's talking about it as what you're
Forthcoming.
forthcoming, and
Okay.
maybe in terms of what becomes present, not in terms of the incarnation or the resurrection and all this stuff. Yeah.
And then is that word then imminence? Is that how we use the word today? Then is this idea of forthcoming essentially in philosophy, like when Deleuze says the plane of
Well, that's
imminence
a different imminence.
That's
in a way.
different completely.
Yeah, because what the plane of imminence is always in a kind of dynamic with the plane of transcendence.
Okay.
So something may present itself imminently to you, but
Mhm.
there's always that possibility of the transcendence. And you have to remember, without this almost possibility, to go back to Chris's very good question.
sorry.
Sort of all, no, I mean, it's very good. Because she's pointing to the lack. Listen, she points out, first of all, in Heidegger, that there's a major lack.
Yeah.
That he never fleshes out the midline, right? And this has been a criticism, of him. It's not the being with others. It's the Dasein that counts, right? It's not being with another or with others that is his concern here. And this is taken up, as I've told you, in Being and Nothingness by Sartre in a section called Concrete Relations with Others in 1943. Sartre writes the phenomenological ontology, that tries to say this is what Heidegger has missed, right? And I'm going to fill it in, in a certain way. So going back to what you're at, in this encounter, we begin to see the moment of the transcendent, right? We begin to see transcendence, right? Which is a going beyond, right? If you will. I mean, moving across the line, etc. So you have this transcendence that is going to. This is more of the objectively present, right? In a sense, this is coming out of what presents itself to you.
Okay, so
Right.
that it already has, in a sense, like that is already constituted imminence. Let's say.
Yes, this is part of something that has been. Yeah, you're going beyond.
Mm-hmm.
This has.
I know what the confusion was. I think
Yeah,
there are
please.
two different words. I think it's imminence.
Yeah,
versus
imminence is.
immanence.
Yeah,
Oh,
I was thinking the same thing.
Okay.
This is
I-
Spinoza.
Immanence is about.
This is
I read it.
Spinoza,
Okay.
the philosophy of nature in
Okay,
itself.
Gotcha.
And that's what Deleuze is speaking to. If that's your confusion.
That is
right?
my
I think
That's
that's
a
what it is,
confusion, it's a
yeah.
spelling confusion.
Yes, yeah.
And a definitional.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see.
Okay.
Because imminence here
Mhm.
is more of the,
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
imminence is forthcoming.
Right,
gotcha.
Immanence is
Yeah.
about imminence.
Right. So Deleuze sets up in Spinoza this kind of movement.
I understand.
This is what he's really, really doing. So you
Right.
have nature naturing, but how do you transcend, right?
Mm-hmm.
To get to,
Okay.
pure energy, if you will, or to, ultimately the energy of the transcendent plane.
I got
And he's talking about planes as in planes of constancy and planes of consistency going on here.
Mhm.
So it's a different approach, yeah. I mean, these guys aren't on all, yeah.
Yeah. No, that was just
Deleuze
like-
has a kind of mathematical language that
Yeah.
Heidegger is going to try to avoid in some ways, Yeah.
Okay.
There's a Cartesianism, still Cartesian and Spinozism speaking through Deleuze here in terms of these planes of immanence and transcendence versus that of the Heidegger, who wants to speak in terms of this language, right? Which is, yeah.
Okay. Well,
But again, the point here is once again, look, the really crucial term is one's own most possibility. That's what you own the most, right? Is your being towards death, right? That's what you own mostly. And if one sees that in its wholeness, etc., one begins to understand, right, the relations which constitute late capitalism, where we are. You're able to see, in a certain way, open up to a very different level of possibility. I think, you begin to see the medical industrial complex for what it is, the medical epistemological. You begin to see epistemology in a different way, how knowledge is formed, what are the conditions for the production of that knowledge. Everything begins to take on a different kind of, elaboration, vision, and framework, right, for you. Because you've had this encounter in the non-relational that allows you to see the relations at work. Work, okay? You get it? Yeah. So, and really, in a way, you're building towards a wholeness here, not a fragmentation anymore. That the fragmentation and the fleeing is something, that is, but it's going to begin there because that's everydayness, that's averageness, that's etc., and the inauthentic, right? Inauthentic means it's not your own most. That's what inauthentic really means to Heidegger, that you're not owning it, right? This is a kind of interesting thing. The inauthenticity is that you're not owning it. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Do you understand?
No,
you're not
I get that
owning.
part,
You're
yeah.
not. Yeah. You have a question? Or?
No.
Okay.
I have to go.
Okay. No problem, Chris. You keep leaving us early. No, until 3 hours.
It's the queue.
I'm just
If
teasing.
you don't get it early, you have to go take a
The queue is
long-
off at 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock? Or?
At 6 o'clock or 6:30, it starts going local, and you got to go through a whole lot of. You got to take the R to the Q.
Yeah, that's
What's
annoying.
That's a nightmare.
We're not
Okay.
with this, true.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. That's the queue's fault. But anyway, I want to say this. I'm working on a place that might be very good for all of us, very close to them. It's on Fulton and Nostrum almost. It's in Bed-Stuy. It's called the Restoration Complex.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know it?
Barrow.
Yeah, very, very close to you guys on
Yeah,
Fulton.
Towns.
What's there?
Yeah, and they have classroom space, and I'm working on that. For you, it's going to be easy because you can catch a C train or an A train
That's
there.
not.
That's not easy.
C train is not convenient to me.
Oh, you're on the west side. That's
I'm
right.
on the east side. The C
On the
train
east
is on
side,
the
sorry,
west
on the
side.
west side,
You know,
yeah.
I have to
okay.
take a bus.
All right, well, we'll think about how we're going to get you there. Yeah. we enjoy dinner with, etc. Yeah. I think the left needs to build a shuttle service, for the shuttling around, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. No need to do so.
I'll work on more
You
writing.
bring back the Third Avenue.
I have your piece printed up, the new one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not done.
No, I'm aware of that. I appreciate the big print. I feel very old, like a print for the blind. Yeah, I can still read the footnotes without glasses. Yeah, I'm going to send Marvel Comics, a story, right? Right. Anyway, all right. So, but listen, before you go, please realize here that with Heidegger, that the Mid-Sein is not fleshed out, right? So when you say that you can feel a loss of a loved one, and this produces anxiety for Heidegger, it's not the kind of anxiety he's really talking about. The anxiety is about your own most possibility, right? And then what that opens in terms of the potentiality, okay? And that the anxiety does not always reveal the loss of someone substantially, It reveals nothingness. It reveals nothing, right? In a sense. And that's why anxiety is very difficult to encounter, because it's not revealing an object, right? We talked a little bit about this distinction in the German language between fear and Furcht, Angst and Furcht, right? Fear always has an object, right? Anxiety has no object.
So anxiety deals with the loss of self?
Anxiety, in terms of being in touch with the anxiety, right, and making it one's own most possibility in the being towards death, reveals nothingness in a certain way, right? And there are many levels to this nothingness, but it reveals a nothingness which actually throws you into a different kind of being there, right? Which begins to see not oneself as fragmented, or that I've got to catch I'm using this as an example, it's not meant personally, that I've got to catch the Q train at a certain time, because of the fragmentation of everyday life, or this is, what I need to do for efficiency purposes. But it opens you up to a much more fuller, existence, vis-a-vis temporality, and your own potentiality for being. Understand this? It's opening you up to a new way of encountering, and experiencing the world.
All right.
It's fuller, It's almost like, in a sense. So he's not dealing with melancholy or loss here. He's dealing with basically what becomes our own most possibility, and that is the being towards death. Right? And how this makes us whole human beings, both structurally and existentially. Now, we can talk about this next week when you're here, so I know you have to go, but Lacan will argue with this too, in a sense that there's no such thing as a wholeness or a unity of the subject, right? And then the struggle becomes the struggle between empty and full speech, enjoying your symptom, all these kind of moments, right? So you have a different, different movement and take here, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that too. But again, it's this book, this text that opens up these possibilities. That's all. That's what we can say about. So okay, so I don't mean to hold you here. Yeah.
Bondage.
Yeah, bondage. Right.
I'm gonna be running around like a rat in a maze trying to get out of this campus.
Let me tell you the easiest way.
I get lost in here.
You're gonna
It took me
walk-
a while to find this.
You're going to walk straight to the end, right here, take the elevator to the first floor. Then you're going to walk straight out the elevator, and you're going to make a left when you get to the gate. You make a right to the gate, and then a left at the gate, and then it'll take you back to DeKalb. What train are you taking? Can you take it at the stop at this time?
Either that or the R.
Okay. Then make a right when you go out, and you'll be at the front of the Q train right there. There's a little stop right there at the corner.
Yeah, just
So you can go either way.
You can go left or right. You're still going to find it.
And if you're on
That's the
east side,
security
you go
guard.
to Nevins
Tell
and
me.
catch the
Yeah.
IRT.
Yeah, you take the IRT to 42nd Street if you want. Yeah. No, I'm just kidding.
What IRT?
No, I'm just
There's
kidding.
an IRT
Yeah.
in Nevins Street.
I don't want the IRT on Nevin Street. I'm gonna get on the R or the Q so I can get it to the east side.
It's right here.
The IRT.
You can't miss, right or left.
Okay.
Right is better in this case, in terms of direction.
Sorry.
Okay, no problem. It's okay. No, you didn't. No problem. Don't worry. Okay, so we kind of have this sense about the possibility. You want to quit or?
No.
Okay. All right. So let me go on, right? So you can see the theoretical knowledge is secondary, right? To here, right? It's a non-relational take, right, etc. So being towards the end does not first arise through some attitude. Rather, it belongs essentially, and I read this already, okay. Sorry, I went back to the same page, right? Okay. Granted care, okay. But if being towards death belongs primarily and essentially to the being of design, it must be demonstrated in everydayness and in an authentic way. So, first of all, we go back to Dasein, our there-ness in everyday life, to see how inauthentically we are living and encountering things. So this is Heidegger. And if being towards the end is even supposed to offer the existential possibility, and this is the crucial phrase, existential wholeness of Dasein, this would give the phenomenal confirmation for the thesis that care is the ontological term for the wholeness of the structural totality of Dasein. You know, you cannot have one without the other. You need care, right, for wholeness, and vice versa, right? So death, right, being towards death, care, right, and wholeness, all related, interrelated here. So we must give a sketch between being towards death as care is not sufficient. Above all, we must see this connection in the concreteness nearest to Dasein in its everydayness. So he's going to go to the everydayness so we can see the care, constitutive moments of care here. Okay? Let me go on to a couple of the things in here in terms of the page 240. It's a shame Chris left because this speaks to exactly what she was talking about. The next page 243. The publicness of everyday being with one another knows death as a constantly occurring event, as a case of death. Someone or another dies, be it a neighbor or a stranger. People unknown to us die daily and hourly. Death is encountered as a familiar event occurring within the world. As such, it remains in the inconspicuous characteristic of everyday encounters. The they has also already secured an interpretation for this event. The fleeting talk about this, which is either expressed or else mostly kept back, says, one also dies at the end, but for one now is not affected. The analysis of one dies reveals unambiguously the kind of being of everyday being towards death. In such talk, death is understood as an indeterminate something, which first has to show up from somewhere, but right now is not yet present for oneself and is thus no threat. One dies spreads the opinion that death, so to speak, strikes the they. It's good, huh? Yeah. He's good at this stuff. This is what he really knows. Yeah, the public interpretation, right, of Dasein says that one dies because in this way, everyone can convince him or herself that in no case is it I myself, for this one is no one. You have fled to say one says, one dies, instead of I die. Right? Okay? Dying is leveled down to an event which does not concern Dasein, but which belongs to no one in particular. If idle talk is always ambiguous, so is this way of talking about death. Dying, which is essentially and irreplaceably mine, is distorted into a public occurring event which the they encounters. Characteristic talk speaks about death as a constantly occurring case. It treats it as something always already real and veils its character of possibility, and concomitantly the two factors belonging to it, that is, its non-relationability and its insuperability. With such ambiguity, Dasein puts itself in the position of losing itself in the they with regard to an eminent potentiality of being that belongs to its own self. The they justifies and increases the temptation of covering over for itself its almost being toward death. Yeah? So we have the great cover up here too, through the dictatorship of the they and the they self, right? And how we speak about one feels this way. You know, you begin to see this grammatically, you see this in the language. Instead of the use of the personal pronoun, one switches, right? Or we switch to, you know, a much more neutral category, which for Heidegger is very fleeting.
And this is where you were pointing out the statistics of death,
Yeah.
for instance.
Yeah, statistics of death, the whole encounter, and then how one ultimately, again, if you see this insuperability and non-relationality in death, you're able then to be able to see how things are made. What are the conditions for the production of those statistics? What are the conditions for the productions of that knowledge? Etc. Right? You begin to break down, if you will, the questions of the medical, juridical complex, if you will. Yeah. There are all kinds of things you can do with this. I mean, in a sense, because what it does is it gives you a completeness. Authenticity really means wholeness in this question. One becomes whole again instead of fragmented. Instead of being a mark for the system, one becomes whole that understands the conditioning and the building of the system, right? In a sense. Whether you want to call it capitalism, but really in a way, I like to just say this gives you the tools, the weapons, if you will, to undo systemic problems, right? You begin to understand systemics instead of just the surface, the description, the outrage, what are we going to do about it, et cetera, et cetera. This goes well beyond politically, in my opinion, protest and resistance, right? Yeah, in a certain way. And another way could be part of another political act that could be, not individualized, but what Stigler calls, the trans-individuation process or individuation processes. It gives you the advantage, of building an immunology to the systemics, right? In a way, you begin to start thinking in terms of what am I going to become immune to, right? In the biopolitical. The biopolitical, by the way, is a statistical outgrowth, right? It is about the dictatorship of the day, the birth of the biopolitical, since we read a little bit of the Foucault last year, right? So it's very interesting to see this at work and then how the biopolitical plays out, in a sense. Yeah.
So
Okay.
individuation, I like this. I'm just to go with this a little.
Yeah, sure, no
It's
problem.
It's a little
Yeah.
clearer.
Yeah, no problem.
So how does that sort of fit with Heidegger's authenticity in a way? The process of individuating that we co-constitute each other in a sense, right? How is that more authentic in a sense than?
Well, I don't know if it's a ranking of authenticity. It's a kind of process of where, again, you have to have your own most
So you have to be
potentiality,
yourself, right, okay.
but once you're there, that process of individuation allows for,
I see.
understanding systemic relations, how those relations were formed, etc. How those relations can be co-constituted, as you said, in a collective.
Right.
In Stiglerian terms and Simondonian terms, more in Simondonian terms, you have psychic individuation, which would be at the beginning of this process of individual, alongside the collective individuation, and then you're in this process in terms of the relationship of things to the world in trans-individuation.
Okay.
So your relations are not inductive and deductive, they're transductive.
Gotcha.
You're being led, through the psychic, the collective and the trans all at once, and this is part of the process for Simondon, who is, not more coming out of techniques, right, rather than the Heideggerian tradition, right?
Okay.
Although there's some similarity. Right. And again, the question of, the existential facticity of death, right? And the existential structure. And remember, he's always operating on dealing, if you go back to this diagram, you have these traits, right, of, existentiality. He's trying to describe this, and he's also looking at structures, right? So this is a very proto-structural work of the existential-ontological, right, in a way. And again, he's trying to destroy and rework Western ontology on the question of going back to the question of being. But the only way we're going to get to being is through Dasein and the authentic Dasein, right? It's not only a question of just us in this room, it's a question of getting back to the question of being and its meaning. When one's life takes on a very different meaning, I would think, certainly I hope we've been there, if one has that encounter with being towards death, right? Yeah, when you begin to say, I no longer am. Yeah, that is a very distinct possibility. It doesn't just become so-and-so died today. I miss so-and-so. I mourn that loss, etc. This is the relations he's trying to, yeah. So what were we going to say? Yeah, please.
I don't know, just to bring up Chris's point,
Yeah.
she was saying that maybe your mother might feel differently if you had died versus her husband. I think that actually brings up the point that maybe the mother considers the child the self, and it is their own death.
Yes, I mean, when you lose a loved one, yes, it's
Well,
true.
no,
it's
I don't
true.
think it's any loved one. I
No,
think
no.
a mother, like if
Yeah,
your
okay.
mother had lost you,
Right.
it would be her losing herself.
Mhm.
I think that's the difference. Maybe it would have been different.
Not in my mother's case. But anyway.
Maybe not, but I think
Yeah, maybe in a lot of other mothers' cases, but certainly not in mine. Yeah, right. Anyway, yeah.
right? Isn't that a thing?
Yeah, I mean that's worth thinking about, but again, that's partial, right? A
Yeah.
part of the self is killed, a part
it's
of me is
fragmentary,
killed
yeah.
in a certain
Not
way,
the
and it
whole.
becomes
It's not the whole,
fragmentary.
yeah.
And again, that's a way of inverting what Heidegger's really trying to say here. I'm
Sure,
not saying
of
you're
course,
wrong.
of course, but
I'm not
just
saying you're
maybe
wrong.
That's a
Yeah,
way
yeah.
to think about
Yeah,
what
yeah.
she
No,
was
I understand. Yeah, yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah. No, I understand that. I'm witnessing this with my aunt. It's been
Yeah.
since June. End of June. It's now 8 months. I think the normal statistical mourning time is 6 months. But she's still. Yeah. That's what I said. I make a yeah. So anyway, but I'm witnessing this, that she's still suffering, like, a whole part. She kind of verifies what you're saying about the mother lost a real huge part, her only son, right? Yeah, yeah.
Just wondering if that's.
Yeah. So, I mean, you see this repeating in her in terms of that. But if she has a possibility, I mean, in terms of her projects, she's been a mother to many, right? And a grandmother, and now a great-grandmother to many, being out
But
of
maybe
that.
this is I'm trying to say maybe this is a primordial understanding of like that mother-child relationship in a way.
Yeah, maybe so. I'd have to
I
think
don't know,
about
but
that.
I just
No, I mean, I like this kind of approach to it, and I'm certainly open to it in a lot of ways. Yeah. No, what makes her happy is seeing her great-grandchildren. You know,
exactly.
that's
I'm
what's going
missing
on.
That with my parents.
Yeah.
Well, especially my mother and
Right,
my brothers, my nephew.
right.
It's like a weird.
Yes. But for Heidegger, again, I just want to go back to Heidegger, and I hear what you're saying. For Heidegger, again, it's the subjectivity of one's own most possibility. So in some ways, that may be a deflection for Heidegger.
That's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So let's go.
Yeah.
Okay. The evasion of death, which covers over, dominates everydayness so stubbornly that in being with another, those closest by often try to convince the one who is dying that he will escape death and soon return to the tranquilized everydayness of his world taken care of. And remember, we made distinguishing things about care, to be taken care of, having concern. Remember this in the structure of care. So, I mean, yeah. All right. So, this concern has the intention of thus comforting the dying person. It wants to bring him back to Dasein by helping him to veil his own most non-relational, completely his own most non-relational possibility. Thus, the they provides a constant tranquilization about death. But basically, this tranquilization is not only for the dying person, but just as much for those comforting him. And even in the case of demise, the carefreeness that the public has provided for itself is still not to be disturbed and made uneasy by the event. Indeed, the dying of others is seen often as a social inconvenience, if not a downright tactlessness, from which the public should be spared. But along with this tranquilization, which keeps Dasein away from its death, the they at the self-time justifies itself and makes itself respectable by silently ordering the way in which one is supposed to behave towards death in general. And this is, with this whole Americanization or the vagueness of, the attitudes towards death, and both David and Chris are gone, but, Jessica Mitford's the great book, The American Way of Death, is a kind of an attempt to look at this descriptively, at least. Even thinking about death regarded publicly as cowardly fear, a sign of insecurity on the part of Dasein and a gloomy flight from the world. The they does not permit the courage. This is very good. The courage to have anxiety about death. Yeah? The dominance of the public interpretedness of the they has already decided what attunement is to determine our stance. Has already determined what the attunement is to determine our stance towards death. And anxiety about death, Dasein is brought before itself, is delivered over to its insuperable possibility. The they is careful to distort this anxiety into the fear of a future event. Right? Anxiety made ambiguous as fear, and this is interesting the way he plays on this, that fear, right? Right? It becomes the ambiguity of the anxiety becomes fear, is moreover taken as a weakness which no self-assured design is permitted to know. What is proper, according to the silent decree of the they, is the indifferent calm as to the fact that one dies. Right? The cultivation of such a superior indifference is strangest, Dasein, from its own most non-relational potentiality of being. Now, in some ways, this is the estrangement from Geist, as well. You can read into this certain forms of alienation, because this is the Entfremdung is the German word for being alienated. Yeah. Okay. Temptation, tranquilization, and estrangement, however, characterize the kind of being a fallen prey. Again, these three moments, right? The addictogenic society, right, etc., the falling prey, right, are engaged temptation, tranquilization, and estrangement. Entangled, everyday being towards death is a constant flight from death. Being toward the end has the mode of evading that end, reinterpreting it always, understanding it inauthentically, and veiling it. Factically, one's own design is always already dying. That is, it is in a being towards its end. And it conceals this fact from itself by reinterpreting death as a case of death. As a case. And this is interesting too. This kind of language of psychology and language again of statistics and, right? A case of death occurring every day with others, a case which always assures us still more clearly that one is oneself still alive. But in the entangled flight from death, the everydayness of Dasein bears witness to the fact that the they self is always already determined as being towards death, even when it is not explicitly engaged in thinking about death. Even in averaged everydayness, Dasein is constantly concerned with its own most non-relational and inseparable potentiality of being, even if only in the mode of taking care of things, in a mode of untroubled indifference that opposes the most extreme possibility of its existence. Always there, this care, right, and being towards death. The exposition of everyday being, however, gives us at the same time a directive to attempt to secure complete existential, right, concept of being toward the end by a more penetrating interpretation in which the entangled being towards death is taken as an evasion of death. That before which one flees has been made visible in a phenomenally adequate way. We should now be able to project phenomenologically how evasive Dasein itself understands its death. Okay? So he's going to look at this kind of structure and how we're masters at evasion. Yeah? Not only through the public out there, but in terms of our own, manipulations and games we play with each other. All right, so, I don't know what you want, if you want to, I mean, we can pick up with this next week. I mean, this is a crucial section, as is, just to go way forward to page 255, he's got a very nice summation of this. What is characteristic about authentic? We're dealing with inauthentic so far, but just to give you a preview, existentially projected being towards us can be summarized as follows. Anticipation, being ahead of oneself, and the anticipatory resoluteness, that's the thing, to design, reveals its lostness in the they-self, how we're so conditioned by the they-self and how others think, right, etc., and brings it face to face with the possibility to be itself, primarily unsupported by concern that takes care, but to be itself in passionate, anxious freedom towards death, which is free of the illusions of the they, the factical, and the certainty of self, of itself. Very interesting, huh? This is an authentic mode that he wants to engage. Now you can ask yourself the question: we'll pick this up next week. Is this a jargon, like Adorno will say, of authenticity, or is this something that we really do experience in a certain way? Remember, Adorno comes from a very wealthy Jewish family in which there's a very different culture at work than this happening here. I'm not saying that that's the only thing, because I don't think death stamps class, right? Or in that way, right? Yeah. So we'll go back to this, because I think it's important to talk about the non-relational and conditions of knowledge production, because this in a way is before epistemology and what Rachel was saying, the primordial relationship. But in a sense, yes, I mean, maybe it's a good starting point to deal with mother, in this way, as Freud does. But at the same time, what is the existential characteristic of this too? Beyond that of the existential - psychological, right? To try to talk about what is the non-relational. Because what do we do, like with characters like the Genet, the orphan consciousness? This kind of levels, these kind of levels that go on, that didn't really have a mother, had the institution as mother, in some ways. And how does this become, quote unquote, a fairly authentic existence going forward? So, yeah, so these are some good questions raised today. All right, good, all right. So we did all right. 6 o'clock. Yeah.